Jetsun Milarepa is arguably the most famous yoga practitioner and poet of Tibet. He is also probably one of the most famous mass murderers in Tibet. And yet, he is essentially a Tibetan saint, akin to the great saints of the Christian and Muslim traditions. The current Dalai Lama himself reveres Jetsun Milarepa almost an entire millennium after his life, citing him as a lifelong eternal teacher. To him, Milarepa is an ideal symbol of perseverance and spiritual accomplishment, despite having been a mass murderer in his youth. This early grave sin, a violent act of revenge that we will look at in great detail today, fundamentally broke Milarepa. It was also the necessary condition for his successful enlightenment within one singular lifetime. This is an incredibly rare feat among most branches of Buddhism, where enlightenment is usually a culmination of many, many virtuous lifetimes. This feeling of reverence toward Jetsun Milarepa on behalf of the Dalai Lama is not limited to the most learned Buddhist elites. It would be difficult indeed to find any native Tibetan who isn't familiar with Milarepa's story and his great spiritual feats. But who is this almost mythical figure that is known throughout all of Tibet and the wider Buddhist world? What exactly did he achieve that cemented such an important religious and cultural legacy for this man, a man who was just as worldly as us, just as fragile and just as lost? Despite having been born in a not-so-distant time, in the first half of the 11th century AD, Milarepa shares a certain trait with many a holy man. His biography is archetypal, i.e. it follows an easy blueprint. It perfectly fits into stories that had already been told. The young Milarepa was a grave sinner. Life had beaten him down to a state of necessity, a state of violence. And upon committing his mass violence, Milarepa was then broken by the weight of his remorse. From this rock bottom, where every day he contemplated ending his own life, he sought out a mentor, and eventually he outgrew this mentor. The student thus became the teacher. He was purified and redeemed. This purification would then be taught to every future generation of Buddhist students, for no fee and with no regard for prior sins. This kind of story is all too familiar to those who enjoy religious tales. In the Christian world, we have Saint Mary of Egypt or Moses the Black, who fit quite perfectly into that very same biographical blueprint of a sinner undergoing an extremely challenging transformation. This sinner then comes out in the end as an individual worthy of forgiveness and respect. However, in the account of Milarepa's life, which we will see today, the personal aspect is the most moving. However holy Jetsun Milarepa may now be to the practitioners of Buddhism, he was at his core just another man. He was guilty of the same crimes and guilty of the same despairing thoughts and unpleasant intentions that we all experience. And yet, within a single lifetime, starting from less than zero in fact, Milarepa achieved full enlightenment and became a Buddha in human form. Today we will see why exactly this saint resorted to mass murder, how the weight of his crimes brought him to a most profound despair, how he suffered for countless years under the strictest mentor and contemplated taking his own life every single night. We will also cover some basic tenets of Buddhism, its history as it relates to Tibet, and how both the teaching and the history manifested in the life story of this sinner turned master. This means that we will also touch briefly on Tibetan shamanism, black magic, and a lot more that is contained within the Buddhist Tibetan mythos. This is the life of Jetsun Milarepa. Milarepa was born in western Tibet in the 11th century AD. As is the case with many mystical figures, the date of his birth is a point of disagreement among historians. The range is currently identified as being between the years 1028 and 1060. The most popular and extensive source on Milarepa's life, however, and the one that we will be relying on for our story today, places Milarepa's birth in the year 1052. Milarepa was born into an affluent family, but Milarepa was not his actual birth name. In Tibetan, Milarepa roughly translates to Mila the cotton-clad, or Mila the one in cotton. He earned this name during his many years of meditation wearing nothing but strips of cotton. We will of course see this later. Mila is the name of his clan. It is essentially a surname, if you will. Every male born within the lineage had the word Mila in his name. The original birth name of Milarepa was thus Milarepa Topaga. Topaga in this case can be translated as delightful to hear or good news. It is important to note that Milarepa enjoyed a lifelong fame for his voice. A foundational piece of Tibetan Buddhist literature is the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa, where he sings beautifully in poetic structure on a variety of Buddhist teachings. Milarepa was not the first practitioner of yoga and magic in his lineage. The first ancestor that the Mila name traces itself from was also a great practitioner of magical arts, white magic specifically, in the forms of healing the sick, battling demons, and so on. On one famous occasion, this original ancestor defeated a demon that was plaguing his village. Having already earned a reputation as a great practitioner of magic, Milarepa's original ancestor came to the rescue and managed to subdue this demon in his village. Having been defeated and in awe of this magical ability, the demon exclaimed in fear, "Papa Mila! Papa Mila!" This translates to, "Father, what a man!" To cement this victory, this expression Mila, what a man, was turned into the title of the lineage. Every single son born into this bloodline from this point onwards would carry the name as a remembrance and honor to the original powerful ancestor. Thus, generational wealth was gathered from these magical services for any person in need and willing to pay. The original ancestor took a wife and began building his lineage. His descendants enjoyed greater and greater wealth, until his grandson squandered all of it in a game of dice. Having lost the entire Mila estate in an unfortunate gamble, the Mila family relocated to the future birthplace of Milarepa himself, a little village called Kya Ngatsa. Here they rebuilt their wealth again, through a combination of magical paid services and lucrative trading. They would travel south to Nepal and bring back all sorts of beautiful goods for sale. It was at this point that Milarepa himself was born. Being the first and only son of his hardworking father, the occasion of his birth was celebrated, and he was given the name Good News. As Milarepa himself attests, his early childhood was perfect. He was raised with love, he was happy, and his entire village celebrated this happy, wealthy family. They had favorable connections with the local nobles, they had a good amount of peasants in their service, and as is very rare indeed, nobody in their village seemed to resent them for the wealth and happiness that they enjoyed. To add even more to this happiness, when Milarepa was 4 years old, his mother gave birth to a girl, his beautiful sister. She will be a character of significance throughout Milarepa's life. As we said, this was as perfect as it could be, but of course this perfection would not last very long. At the age of 7, Milarepa lost his father, the patriarch of the Mila name. It began as a sudden disease, and the local doctors concluded very quickly that they would not be able to help him. Medication would be futile. Wanting to set his affairs in order before his inevitable death, Milarepa's father called every friend and relative for one final gathering, where he publicly announced his will. It was rather simple. The entire estate is to be watched over by a trustee until Milarepa comes of age, at which point he is to inherit everything: the fields, the house, the silver, the gold, the sacred books, and so on. It was decided that these trustees would be the siblings of Milarepa's father, i.e. Milarepa's paternal aunt and uncle. After all, they were also part of the Mila lineage. Perhaps it would be better to keep these things within the family. Everybody agreed to this plan, and Milarepa's father shortly passed away. Some of his estate was used to fund a funerary ceremony, where countless individuals touched by the Mila family came to pay their respects. This beautiful, expensive funeral would be the last time that Milarepa saw any beauty among his family. The happy childhood chapter would now come to a close. Shortly following the funeral, Milarepa's uncle and aunt moved into his house. Immediately, they took all of his wealth for themselves. Milarepa, his sister, and his mother were to touch nothing and to own nothing. They were now as good as servants. In the summer, the three of them would work the family fields all day long and give the entire yield to the uncle. In the winters, they would spend their entire days working with wool and fabrics. Every product here was given to the aunt. Whatever profit was made from both of these industries was pocketed by the aunt and uncle, of course. Milarepa, his sister, and his mother saw no profits whatsoever. They were not given any of the fine food that the aunt and uncle enjoyed. Their clothes were random rags held together by strings of rope, and they worked to death in the fields. Their bodies were covered with bruises and sores and raw skin. As Milarepa himself said, our food was fit for dogs and our work for donkeys. The three of them became extremely malnourished, pale, and constantly sick, while the conniving uncle and aunt enjoyed what was essentially a royal life. The villagers who saw this shed many tears for the fate of the Mila family, but they had no power at all to do anything about it. After all, they collectively relied on the harvests and produce of the Mila estate. It was a respectable part of local business. The will of Milarepa's late father did not account for any of this. On paper, his wishes were still being respected, and perhaps the aunt and uncle were simply overindulging before they give everything back to Milarepa when he turns of age. This point of view was awfully optimistic, of course. Milarepa suffered in this way for 7 years. In many cultures of the past, a child was considered to become of age at 15. This was also the case for Milarepa. At this age, he was supposed to finally receive his inheritance. His malevolent uncle and aunt were supposed to throw a major feast for his birthday, step aside, and rely on his generosity to continue enjoying at least some of the wealth he would now control. It goes without saying that none of this happened. If not for his mother, there would have been no celebration of Milarepa's birthday at all. He would have stayed a servant indefinitely or have the choice to leave this house without a single coin to his name. Both of these options would have been arduous and of very little potential for health, safety, and happiness. Thankfully, Milarepa's mother did not forget about the birthday of her unfortunate son. Anticipating this day weeks in advance, she gathered whatever provisions she could for a feast. Sometimes she would raid the pantry of the uncle and aunt and take a little beer to be stocked for Milarepa's forthcoming feast. Her own side of the family, despite being very poor, gave her what they could from their own produce, in secret. His mother eventually managed to amass enough things to throw her own feast for her son's birthday. This feast was to come with an important announcement, for which she demanded that every person of any relation at all to the family come as witnesses to the grand event. Everything went according to plan. Crowds of people arrived on the day of Milarepa's birthday. The uncle and aunt had no choice but to indulge the event. Milarepa's mother made offerings of produce to all of the guests, and especially to the uncle and aunt, in an attempt to sweeten them up before her grand announcement. Amid the festivities, her time to speak had thus arrived. Milarepa's mother declared to every individual present, "You were all there when my late husband read his will, and so you are aware that once my son Mila becomes of age, he is to receive the estate in full from the hands of the trustees. Today, this day has come." Turning to the uncle and aunt, she demanded that they put what is rightfully Milarepa's back into his own name, with countless witnesses behind her. Ideally, this act would have marked the end of their sufferings, but family affairs are never that simple. Visibly enraged, the uncle snapped back at Milarepa's mother. His response was that nothing belonged to Milarepa in the first place, since they themselves had lended all of the belongings to Milarepa's father back in the day, allegedly. The fact that the uncle and aunt now had the estate was only them rightfully getting back everything that they ever lent to Milarepa's father all those years ago when he was first establishing himself in his trading business. He asked Milarepa's mother to present at least one valuable item that truly belonged to her. Of course, she could not do this, on account of them having taken everything from her. The uncle proceeded to point out that even the food at this feast belonged to him. A lot of it had been gathered either on his fields or by the village workers that he employed. As a final comment, he added that Milarepa, his sister, and his mother were lucky that he did not kick them out in the first place 7 years ago. As he saw it, after the wealth had been transferred following the funeral, they now lived on his dime, out of his pockets. He was generous enough to feed them and provide them work to occupy their time, instead of freezing to death in the plateaus and mountains of Tibet. The uncle then stood up furiously and beat Milarepa's mother as she wailed on the ground in front of her friends and family. He also laid his hands on Milarepa's sister and Milarepa himself. Nobody did anything to stop him. After some time, the uncle laid off and gave his final statement. "We will give you nothing. If there are many of you, go ahead and make war on us. If there are few of you, go ahead and cast spells on us. We will give you nothing." On this note, the uncle and aunt departed, leaving Milarepa and his family behind to be consoled by the other guests. Every person in attendance of the feast shed many tears for the poor Milarepa. Born into this world with such great prospects, he was diminished to nothing by none other than his own flesh and blood. As a child, he sang beautiful, happy songs and always had a smile on his face. But now they hadn't heard his talented voice in countless years. Milarepa's maternal side of the family also attended this feast. Milarepa's maternal uncle consoled them and told them that they should come to live at his farm. He did not have much to offer them at all, and they would have to do the same work as they had done up until this point, but at least all of this would be in more humane, loving conditions, with proper food. Had his maternal uncle known that things were this bad, he would have offered this much earlier, but he really did not have much to give in the first place. Additionally, he recommended that Milarepa be sent away to get an education. This was their only guarantee of ever seeing any comfort again. Milarepa could learn how to read and write, and he could probably get a job of wandering from village to village and reading prayers for the illiterate. This would never match the wealth they lost to the uncle, but it was better than nothing, and if Milarepa was to stay behind instead, he would definitely never amount to much. As much as it hurt Milarepa's mother to send him away with nothing to his name, she nevertheless agreed to the entire plan. They moved to the farm of her brother, and Milarepa was sent away to be educated. Milarepa's sister spent her time begging in nearby villages, while the mother worked the fields and the fabrics. The profits were split fairly within the household, and parts were sent to Milarepa in order for him to fund his education. This was nowhere near ideal. Their clothes were still in rags, their food was still lacking, but they no longer lived like dogs. As Milarepa himself said, they were now surviving, but they were still not happy. Milarepa's education went along just fine. He learned how to read and write and spent much time with his tutor and fellow students. Receiving an education at that time also very much meant simply following your tutor around and emulating him. For one part of the day, you practice your literary skills and receive feedback. And for the other parts of the day, you work in the fields and do whatever your tutor demands of you. One day, it just so happened that Milarepa's tutor had a wedding to attend. The job of delivering the wedding gifts from the tutor's house to the wedding fell on Milarepa, and after his job was done, he got to enjoy many festive beers with his tutor. It was at this wedding, under the influence of many fine beers, that Milarepa for the first time in a long time broke out into song after hearing the wedding choir. It was as though years and years of repressed melodies came bursting out. His voice resonated through every creek and valley, and he continued singing throughout the entirety of his journey home after the festivities. Milarepa's mother heard his voice as he approached the house and could not believe her ears. She was overwhelmed by shame and fury. How could her son, having been wronged so severely, be singing so joyfully? Does he not feel a profound sadness for his mother, for his sister, and ultimately for himself? Does he not hold an all-consuming grudge toward his enemies, the uncle and aunt? His mother ran out of the house and exploded at him. She scolded him for being so joyous in the face of their suffering. Overflowing with tears and words, she did not take a single second to breathe. Her emotions quite literally overwhelmed her, and she fainted before Milarepa's feet. Hearing all of this commotion, Milarepa's sister also ran out of the house and began weeping at the state of her mother. Seeing the two women of his life in this state, Milarepa snapped out of his song and also began to weep in misery. His mother eventually regained consciousness, and Milarepa asked her what it is that she wants him to do. Her answer was extremely direct and evidently well thought out. She told Milarepa that she wishes for him to destroy their enemies, to wipe out their lineage. In an ideal world, he would ride a horse through their village and cut down every person who ever contributed to their suffering, including the uncle and aunt. But Milarepa does not have a horse, nor is he trained in any form of combat, and she thus recalled the uncle's words: "If there are few of you, go ahead and cast spells on us." This is exactly what she wanted for Milarepa. She hysterically commanded her son to go and seek out a master of black magic and study under him until he can curse the entire village and every future descendant, to destroy the uncle and aunt through magic, to destroy their crops and houses. The karmic consequences of this were irrelevant to her. She was far too blinded by her pain to see the downside of setting her son down this path. In fact, she gave Milarepa no choice. She told him that if he comes back to her without learning any black magic, she would force him to watch as she takes her own life. This emotional manipulation was unfortunately successful. Milarepa was willing to do anything in order for his mother's suffering to end. The family quickly gathered whatever offerings they could to pay Milarepa's future mentor and prepared for his departure. Within a few days, Milarepa set out in search of a specific, well-known mentor of magic in the region of Yarlung. We will use the Tibetan word Lama from now on to denote a mentor of any kind. Milarepa was accompanied by numerous other students whom he met along the way. They were all seeking the training of the renowned Yarlung Lama. Milarepa and his travel companions finally arrived at the school grounds of this Lama, and they all made their obligatory offerings. Every person who came alongside Milarepa had immensely valuable things to give to the Lama in return for his teaching. Entire animals for their meat and bones, beautiful gemstones, rare artifacts, and mountains of gold. Milarepa was very much outclassed by their wealth. His material offerings were minute in comparison, and so there was no real reason for the Lama to take Milarepa on as a student. Being perfectly aware of this, Milarepa fell to his knees before the Lama and declared his ultimate offering. He would give him his entire body, speech, and mind. This is a very significant offering indeed. The historical Buddha spoke of these three things as the three doors, the three ways that sentient beings interact with the world, and through which they generate either positive or negative karma. In the Tibetan esoteric tradition, these are also the three secrets. By engaging in correct, secret practices, each of these parts can serve in the actualization of one's Buddhahood, i.e., one's enlightenment. In short, Milarepa offered his very essence to the Lama. He signaled total submission to his teaching by giving up the three means he possesses to interact with the world. As he made this offering, he also explained his situation to the Lama. He explained that his neighbors and family have wronged him and made him suffer, that he is here to punish them through learned magic. The Lama smiled and told him that he will consider his request. Until he decides whether he can teach him destructive magic, Milarepa is to follow the regular curriculum of beneficial magic, healing, summoning good weather, and so on. It is important for us to touch upon magic itself from the Tibetan perspective here. Prior to the arrival of Buddhism in Tibet in the 6th century BC, the native indigenous religion was a shamanistic one. It is called Bon, B-O-N. It is quintessentially shamanistic, i.e. filled with rituals performed by shamans. These are the spiritual medium in human form between man and nature. As is the case with most shamanism, there is a combined use of mantras, ritual tools, and physical practices. All of these result in the shaman achieving a trance state from which he gains insight into the balance of the cosmos. More importantly, he achieves insight into the specific misbalances that are causing some worldly issue to arise. He then performs the proper rites, whether physical or verbal, to bring the balance back in order. By doing so, he appeases the spiritual deities that have been aggravated through this misbalance, and thus he heals the subject in front of him, i.e. the person who sought out the shaman in the first place. One remarkable thing about Buddhism is that it is an incredibly adaptable religion. A variety of historical Buddhist syncretisms only prove this point. I invite you to investigate the short-lived phenomenon of Greco-Buddhism as an example. A video on the subject is forthcoming. As such, when Buddhism arrived in Tibet, it felt no need to eradicate the long-present indigenous religion of Bon. Instead, due to having arrived in a form that was already rather suitable for the Tibetans, the Buddhist religion effortlessly adopted the pre-existing local customs of Bon. It is for this reason that Tibetan Buddhism often appears to have such a vital, shamanistic flair in its cosmology and practice. It is also worth noting that it wasn't merely Buddhism that adopted the Bon religion into its framework. This relationship is reciprocal. Just a century or so prior to Milarepa's own life, the indigenous Bon religion was written down and codified as Yungdrung Bon, the eternal Bon. In this case, it was Bon that adopted certain Buddhist elements into its own initial indigenous framework. The difference here might seem negligible, but it is important. Ultimately, what separates Buddhism with parts of Bon in it, and Bon itself with parts of Buddhism in it, is the manner in which the religions are practiced. Bon has a much more shamanistic approach of rites and ancestral worship, whereas Buddhism at its core is an introspective meditative religion. Perhaps the easiest terms to use as an analogy here would be to denote this difference as the difference between the soul and the mind. All of this is to say that when we refer to magic in the Tibetan realm, we are drawing upon an indigenous shamanistic concept, which is then filtered through the Buddhist lens. For our purposes, magic here indicates the use of verbal incantations, elaborate geometric diagrams, and physical movements in order to affect the elements of the world. In some cases, Tibetan magic of this time period is nothing more than the passionate reading of a prayer, which is then to assist in the healing of some disease in the subject. In other cases, however, weeks and weeks of profound, total body concentration are needed in order to summon something as powerful as a devastating storm. Countless offerings must be made to countless deities as a thank you for allowing this sort of spontaneous natural misbalance to be caused by the practitioner. Tibetan magic is therefore the alignment of the practitioner with the entire natural world, and then a manipulation of its energies through the use of tried and tested phrases, images, and movements. This is what Milarepa was to learn with the Yarlung Lama. For the next year of his life, Milarepa diligently studied under the Lama, but he did not receive any of the teachings that he truly desired. He and his fellow students were shown numerous beneficial incantations, as well as general useful practices for the harnessing of magical power. As far as the other students were concerned, this was everything that the Lama could teach them. And so, after honing their practice for a year, the students got ready to embark upon their journeys of selling their magical services. It was only Milarepa who was not yet ready to leave. His conscience was still profoundly troubled by what his mother had told him last year, that she would end her life if he were to return without destructive magic under his sleeve. Nevertheless, the departing ceremony had to commence. The Lama gave parting gifts to each of his students, Milarepa included, and the group of students left the school together. Milarepa, however, was not gone for long. He made half a day's journey with his classmates and then said goodbye to each of them. Turning around, he gathered piles of manure into the front of his shirt and brought them back to the Lama's house. Here he used the manure to fertilize the Lama's fields. The Lama observed this from the terrace of his house and commented to some of his monks that he had never before seen a student who was as dedicated and kind-hearted as Milarepa. No other student would have thought to make this effort for the fields of the Lama on his own initiative. And on top of this, he recalled how Milarepa offered his body, speech, and mind when he first came to the school. It would be a pity not to fulfill his demands, but black magic is no light affair. In order to ensure that this teaching wasn't intended for some other sinister motive, the Lama had a monk travel to Milarepa's village to verify his story. While the monk was gone, the Lama had Milarepa himself recount his story yet again, and remind him of the specific reasons why he needs to obtain knowledge of the destructive arts. His explanation was satisfactory, and when the monk returned with a confirmation of everything that Milarepa had previously recounted, the Lama finally submitted. The Yarlung Lama told Milarepa of another Lama, not too far from here, in Nup Khulung, whose expertise was precisely in the destructive arts. He had an agreement with this other Lama. Whoever the Yarlung Lama sends to him is immediately vouched for, and thus Milarepa only had to show up and state that he comes from the Yarlung Lama. He would then immediately begin his studies of black magic. Just to be sure, the Yarlung Lama gave Milarepa a letter of recommendation as well, and thus Milarepa departed joyfully. He would finally make his mother happy and get revenge on all those people who had wronged his family for so long. Milarepa and the Nup Khulung Lama immediately got to work. The Lama instructed the young man to build a special house for the purposes of chanting a spell from inside, and then taught him each step of a destructive incantation. Milarepa spent a week inside this house, doing nothing but chanting this specific spell. In most cases, a week was enough, but Milarepa wanted to ensure the efficacy of his spell, and so he spent an extra week in deep concentration. Following these 14 intense days, the Lama informed Milarepa of his results. His spell managed to secure the forthcoming destruction of 35 people. This is the sum that the guardian deities agreed to. The following morning, the Lama once again confirmed that the fates of all but 2 people were sealed. It was up to Milarepa to decide whether the last two beings are also destroyed. These beings were, of course, the source of all his suffering, his paternal uncle and aunt. Wanting to exact the highest amount of pain possible, Milarepa said that they should be spared, so that they can witness the extent of his vengeance. To a man bent on revenge, causing someone to actively suffer instead of simply ending their life is always a much more appealing option. It was thus that the young Milarepa, after years of suffering, finally tasted the bittersweet nectar of vengeance. However, I would like us to consider an important point. How much of this desire for vengeance actually came from Milarepa himself? Would it not be more correct to say that he was coerced into this act by his mother, that he was emotionally manipulated to exact revenge on her behalf much more than his own? As far as we can tell from his life up until this point, Milarepa was of a fundamentally kind heart. While he learned how to read and write, he had no thoughts of getting revenge. All that truly concerned him was the end of his own suffering and the suffering of his family. There are many popular modern accounts of Milarepa's life which prescribe a desire for revenge to him specifically, but I think such a claim is unsubstantiated. What seems evident, at least to me, is that the primary lesson here is much more about the fact that being attached to the desires and outcomes of others can in turn inflict great negative karma on the doer himself. The heavy cost of more than 30 lives taken fell on Milarepa due to the desires and emotional attachments of his mother more than his own. Nevertheless, the destructive deed was sealed. Milarepa could now return home for two reasons. First of all, to confirm the effects of his spell, and then to inform his mother of the good news. But he would not make it that far. What happened was this. The spell did indeed have an effect. During a grand wedding feast that the uncle and aunt hosted in their house, Milarepa's magic caused their house to collapse. 35 people inside had been crushed. The uncle and aunt survived, on account of having left the house briefly to prepare their wedding speeches. Milarepa's sister heard of this immediately, and she informed their mother. Their mother ran outside and began to cry with joy. She was shouting at the top of her voice that her son had finally exacted their family's vengeance. But the reaction of the villagers was not what she expected. Even though most people were sympathetic, they found this manner of revenge far too brutal. 35 people was a significant amount of lives lost for a village. Even if on paper they did agree with some form of revenge, this was simply too much. The relatives of the victims immediately began to stir up the village. The Mila family must be punished for such an atrocity. The elders of the village agreed that they must arrest the mother and take her life, and they should also find out where Milarepa himself is in order to do the same to him. Milarepa's mother would not give up so easily, however. She learned of this plot very quickly from some people who were very sympathetic to her situation, and she drafted 2 letters immediately. One of these letters was intended for Milarepa, in which she tells him of his success and that the village is now furious. In this letter, she demanded more magic on his behalf to destroy the village even further. The second letter she wrote was for the village itself, and she faked it to be a letter from Milarepa. In this letter, Milarepa apparently threatens the villagers with severe magical destruction if they do not immediately cease their plot against the Mila family. This letter proved to be very effective. In their great fear of Milarepa's capabilities, the villagers instantly gave up on their plot and agreed to give whatever they can to Mila's mother. Thus, after approximately 16 years of poverty, Milarepa's mother finally got back the estate of her late husband. But at what cost? The problem with sending several letters at once is that circumstances can change very quickly, quicker than the letters can keep up with. By the time that Milarepa received his mother's letter asking for more destruction, the villagers had already been pacified, but Milarepa had no way of knowing this new development. Since the letter made it out to be far too dangerous, Milarepa did not return home, and so he proceeded on the assumption that more destructive magic must indeed be brought upon the village in order to save his mother. Therefore, Milarepa returned to his Lama and asked for an even more powerful spell. Their plan was to conjure a major hailstorm in the village that would ruin all of their crops. In order to ensure the most damage possible, the Lama advised that Milarepa wait until the crops are almost fully grown, right before their harvest, and then send the storm. This is precisely what Milarepa did. The annual harvest of the village was decimated. Even though lives had not been taken directly, surely this caused an immense amount of suffering from the ensuing starvation and economic consequences. The worst part of it all is that this could have been entirely avoided. Milarepa's mother only had to wait a few more days before sending him that letter. Through her schemes and machinations, Milarepa only further clouded his own heart and mind via the generation of immensely negative karma. Thus, our first major chapter on Milarepa's life ends. Considering the length of this story, I would like to briefly summarize what we have seen so far. Milarepa, having been born into most promising circumstances, was cheated out of his inheritance. He was abused and neglected by his uncle and aunt. Milarepa's mother, as another victim of this abuse, incited Milarepa to pursue the destructive arts and enact revenge on her behalf. Milarepa did this successfully, but as we are about to see, this would uproot Milarepa's well-being in a most severe fashion. There are few men in the world who would not crumble under the weight of dozens of lives taken. Milarepa remained with his Lama following the near destruction of his village. He continued to work in his service and learned what he could, but none of this felt significant anymore. Milarepa was crushed by the weight of his actions. An immense sense of guilt coated every fiber of his being. At night he could not sleep. During the day he could not get out. If he did manage to get out, he wanted nothing more but to return to his bed. And while he laid in bed, he grew restless from just how suffocating his feeling of guilt was. Milarepa could not eat, nor keep any food down. The only thing that he wanted at this point was liberation from his overwhelming remorse. In the Tibetan society of his time, this liberation of course meant to embrace the Buddhist path, to embrace the teaching, the Dharma. Fortunately for him, the circumstances of his Lama made this journey a possibility. At this time, Milarepa's Lama was in the service of a certain wealthy landowner. This landowner was battling a severe illness, which the Lama attempted to heal through magical means. Unfortunately, however, his magic was not enough. This longtime patron of the Lama succumbed to his illness during the course of Milarepa's remorseful suffering. The Lama was profoundly affected by this passing. He came to Milarepa and expounded a very important truth, a truth that coincidentally one finds at the core of the Buddhist teaching. All composite things are impermanent. Yesterday, my very kind benefactor died. This is why the cycle of birth and death troubles my heart. I am old, and in my reflection I recognize how much harm I have done to the world through my teaching of the destructive arts. Even you, Milarepa, are so young, and yet you have already accumulated such great crimes through our magic. These crimes rest on my shoulders as well. Milarepa's instinct was to argue with his Lama, to cheer him up by pointing out that the Lama also did good in the world. He had applied his healing magics wherever he could. It's not his fault that his benefactor passed away. But this had no effect on the Lama. His position was that he did not help enough beings achieve liberation. He knows all of the theory, but he does not know how to apply it, i.e., he knows that people suffer within the cycle of death and rebirth. What he does know how to apply only perpetuates this cycle of birth and death. His healing magic has never allowed someone to escape the painful cycle entirely. For this reason, the Lama wishes to bring his career to an end and put his theoretical knowledge into action. He wants to set out on the Buddhist path of practice. Therefore, at this point, without his own choosing, Milarepa was faced with two options. He can either replace the Lama at the school and take on all of his current disciples, or he can also embark on the very same Buddhist path of seeking the Dharma, and thus atone for his heavy crimes, effectively ending his career as a student of sorcery. I believe we can all see how this opportunity arrived at the perfect time for the remorseful, despairing Milarepa. He chose to also embark on the path of the Dharma and finally get some relief from his heavy heart. With their mutual agreement to pursue the Dharma, Milarepa's Lama directed him to a Buddhist teacher in the village of Nar. Here Milarepa could finally begin his Buddhist path. Milarepa very quickly made his journey and offered himself as a student to the Buddhist Lama of Nar. The Lama, hearing his story, was very glad to accept him. According to this Lama, the path forward was not easy, but it was simple. If Milarepa takes adequate time to meditate daily on his newfound material, liberation from his remorse and sin would very quickly be within his grasp. Of course, this could not be further from the truth. Milarepa was very happy to hear that all he had to do was meditate. He recalled how it only took him 2 weeks to summon a great catastrophe in his village. Since this path of liberation was promised to be so simple, all Milarepa really had to do was meditate. Since meditation itself seemed so easy, he would only need to do it for 1 single day, probably no more than that. He would then attain full enlightenment and be on par with the historic Buddha. Thus, emotionally pacified, Milarepa resorted to merely sleeping. He spent days on end lying around in bed, believing that his enlightenment was just around the corner, and so he continued catching up on his sleep, feeling mentally at peace with what he has to do. The Lama was quite disappointed in his student's behavior, and having observed that Milarepa is making no effort at all to even meditate, he very quickly reproached him, and told him that he could not teach him anything after all. He had spoken too soon at their initial meeting. As an act of compassion, the Lama pointed him in the direction of another teacher, in the southern province of Lobrak. This new teacher was the renowned Marpa Lotsawa, or Marpa the Translator. Upon hearing this name, Milarepa suddenly broke into tears of joy. Every hair on his body vibrated, and every thought he had was entirely concentrated on this future teacher. This was a reaction of cosmic proportions. Milarepa himself did not know why he felt such joy at the prospect of meeting a total stranger. Marpa the Translator lies at the foundation of the historical development of Tibetan Buddhism. As his title indicates, he was responsible for the translation and transmission of a vast amount of Buddhist teachings from India. These teachings form a part of the Tibetan Buddhist canon to this very day, unchanged in their form since Marpa's own scholarly efforts. Much like Milarepa, Marpa was born into an affluent family, and the wealth of his family allowed him to receive an extensive education. Part of this education included the study of Sanskrit. As a young adult, wishing to set out on the Buddhist path, Marpa traveled to Nepal and studied the local Dharma tradition. As soon as he returned home, he liquidated his entire inheritance and used these funds to travel yet again, this time to India. It is in India that Marpa had the fortune of studying under several legendary gurus. His first period of study in India lasted 12 years, and he would return to India another 2 times. During one of these trips, he had received a prophecy of note. Marpa was destined to outlive his only son and remain without future biological lineage. However, his legacy would survive through his disciples, and notably, one of his disciples will fulfill the role of being his true spiritual son. He was fated to meet this successor upon his return to Tibet. Having learned as much as he possibly could and set on spreading the Indian Dharma in his homeland, Marpa eventually retired to Tibet permanently and spent countless years translating every sacred text that he managed to bring back with him. The 2 most important sets of texts were the 6 yogas of Naropa and the Mahamudra teachings, mostly in the form of commentaries upon otherwise orally transmitted yogic practices. These 2 sets of texts are a small but very significant foundation of Vajrayana Buddhism. That night, as Milarepa departed in search of his new teacher, Marpa the Translator had a most peculiar dream. One of his great masters from India came to him and handed him a holy object. His instructions were very clear. Marpa is to notice all of the impurities on this object and wash them away. He is then to set this object down so that it can be consecrated by all the Buddhas of the past and future. This would be his banner of victory. Marpa awoke from this dream with an overwhelming sense of joy and responsibility. He told his wife about it and concluded that even though the dream was evidently important, he currently has no way to interpret it, since he does not really understand the underlying cause behind the dream. On top of this, he also has no time to sit around and dig in these dreams. There was a lot of work to be done in the fields. Marpa, having been born as a layman, had no issues with occasionally doing the work that others would relegate to servants and laborers. Thus, he set out to plow his fields. Milarepa arrived in the province of Lubrak and began asking around for the renowned Marpa. Surprisingly, nobody could direct him properly. There were indeed Buddhist teachers in this province, but the translator title was not ringing any specific bells, at least not with the villagers that Milarepa had encountered up until this point. However, at last, Milarepa came across a young boy. He posed him the same question: where can I find the Buddhist Lama Marpa the translator? The boy pointed out a man working the fields and told him that this was his father. Maybe he could ask him for directions. Coincidentally, the boy described his father as a very learned man who spends most of his time buried in books. Surely, however, a great translator and Buddhist Lama would not be plowing the fields. Milarepa once again, for some unknown reason, was overwhelmed by an unexplainable joy as he approached this man. He stood in front of him and asked for directions once again. This man looked Milarepa up and down for quite a long while, in silence, and then asked him, "Who are you?" Milarepa replied that he is a great sinner and he has been sent to meet the renowned Marpa the translator. "Very well, I shall take you to meet Marpa, but for now, plow this field. Work hard." The man then left Milarepa to work. After some hours, the young boy from earlier came to fetch Milarepa and told him that he must come to his house in order to meet the Lama. Milarepa finished off the remainder of his work and followed the boy to his house. As he entered the house, he saw the same man from earlier. He was now sitting on a cushion, eating a meal. His face was half covered with soil and dust from his earlier work. Surely this working man cannot be the Lama, Milarepa thought. What is happening here? As Milarepa mentally questioned his circumstances, the working man spoke. "It is true that you do not know me. I am Marpa. Prostrate yourself before me." Milarepa immediately got down before Marpa's feet and presented himself. He was a great sinner. He recounted his entire story. He then once again presented his body, mind, and speech as an offering to the teacher, asking in return for food, clothing, and the Buddhist teaching. Marpa considered everything he had just heard and then responded, "I appreciate your offering, but I will not be able to give you everything that you have asked for. If I give you food and clothing, you will have to get your teaching elsewhere. If you want the teaching instead, then you'll have to find another way to secure your food and clothing. You have to choose. Let me add, even if you do choose the teaching, your enlightenment will be entirely dependent on your own efforts. You will have to work." This was Marpa's very first official test for Milarepa. A student who chooses his physical well-being over the priceless teaching is not worthy of being a student at all. He is not mindful of how great the disparity is between the value of the Dharma and the value of material, impermanent things. Fortunately, Milarepa chose the teaching. He was still very much motivated by the ever-present weight of remorse in his heart. He was grateful to even have the opportunity to choose. As a sign of his gratitude, Milarepa tried to offer his only possession to the Lama's home shrine. He had a book containing all of his magic spells. Marpa immediately shouted at him and told him to never bring such vile things into his house again, to not defile the shrine with such dark objects. Milarepa abided. And so began yet another immensely difficult period of Milarepa's life, his arduous and strict study under Marpa the translator. Milarepa spent over 6 years in what was essentially total servitude under the great Marpa. This servitude was extremely difficult. In some aspects, it caused more suffering to Milarepa than anything he had experienced up until this point. Marpa the translator was relentless, and he was ruthless, both physically and emotionally. Milarepa was often made to feel as the most worthless student that anybody had ever come across. His endless days of toiling in the fields and outside were treated as nothing, as though his work is worth less than that of a donkey. On many an occasion, Milarepa even wanted to leave and abandon his study of the Dharma entirely. The only reason for this was due to how Marpa was treating him. Milarepa would cry himself to sleep and often considered taking his own life, and every time that Marpa learned of this, all he would say is that Milarepa can leave if he so wishes. Marpa really couldn't care less, or at least this is how he presented himself. As we will see much later, the results that came from Marpa's approach paint a very different picture. In order to break the linear, episodic monotony of our tale thus far, we will simply cover an episode that best illustrates just how difficult this period was for Milarepa. Before we do this, however, we must touch on a few points of utmost importance in order for us to properly understand why Milarepa's education took the shape that it did. Here we must talk of the different Buddhist schools as a whole, and also specifically on the Vajrayana Buddhist school. We will also touch upon how this school treats the relationship between the master and student. This is very important. Buddhism is traditionally split into three schools. These are the Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. You may have heard of these under different names. They are often referred to as the lesser vehicle, the great vehicle, and the diamond vehicle, respectively. At their foundations, these three schools are the same religion. They are all concerned with achieving enlightenment and thus breaking the endless cycle of death and rebirth. Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana developed in this listed order. The Theravada tradition, which translates to the school of the elders, was the first school, among many others which eventually died out. It is a survivor. For a Western viewer, Christian orthodoxy is a fitting analogy here in terms of how this school positions itself in relation to the Buddha's original teachings. Thailand and its neighboring countries still predominantly practice this form of Buddhism. We will lay out the differences of all three schools in just a little bit. Mahayana Buddhism, in turn, developed later as a proper competing school to Theravada, but the debate as to its true origins is still very much open. Some scholars define Mahayana Buddhism as a reformist movement that grew out of the original early religion, before there were any major splits, i.e. the school's existence was entirely a reaction to certain trends seen within other schools. Other scholars believe that Mahayana was simply one of the countless interpretations that the early Buddhists followed, and it did not even have any intentions of competing or reforming any of the other schools. Lastly, we have the Vajrayana school. This school formed much later. It is still the youngest of the three. Vajrayana, or Tantric Buddhism as it is often called, grew out of the Mahayana school specifically. It did not coexist with the other schools during the early days of the religion. As we will see in just a moment, Mahayana and Vajrayana share all of their core philosophical foundations. Vajrayana Buddhism, i.e. Tibetan Buddhism, is essentially Mahayana with more on top. We could spend countless hours denoting every single tiny difference between the three traditions, and especially so within the sub-branches that exist within the three major schools, but let us keep it rather straightforward for today. By far the most important difference to understand here is the goal, or the ideal for each practitioner within the three schools. In Theravada Buddhism, your ideal, your goal, is to become an arhat. This is a being who has achieved full enlightenment for himself by following the path of the original Buddha. He thus liberates himself, and only really himself, from the painful cycle of death and rebirth. The liberation of others around him can be a positive byproduct, but it is not the main goal. In short, Theravada Buddhism is the achievement of personal nirvana. On the other hand, in Mahayana Buddhism, your ideal is to become a bodhisattva. The bodhisattva purposefully delays his full enlightenment in order to help all other sentient beings. The ideal here is to get as close as possible to the enlightened state, and then stop. You then turn your practice toward assisting all the other beings that are also locked in the cycle of death and rebirth. In short, Mahayana Buddhism is the delaying of personal nirvana in favor of helping all other sentient beings. As we just said, Vajrayana Buddhism grew out of Mahayana Buddhism, and thus the ideal for the Vajrayana school is exactly the same, to become a bodhisattva. The path to this ideal, however, is the major difference between these two schools. In Mahayana Buddhism, the practitioner meditates on the emptiness of all things, that there is no inherent existence of any one object or person that isn't dependent on something else, i.e. the profound law of cause and effect. The practitioner meditates on this and cultivates two virtues, wisdom and compassion. Guided by Buddhist texts and his own insights into the nature of the world, the practitioner assists others in seeking these very same truths, the truth of interdependence primarily, and he then guides everybody around him to liberate their suffering. Through a certain moral code, he thus accumulates merit, and over many, many lifetimes of sticking to this practice, he should eventually become so great that he liberates every living being. The amount of lifetimes required for this varies very much, but traditionally it is considered to be 7 lifetimes. Vajrayana Buddhism, on the other hand, takes all of this and adds to it esoteric practices. These practices are still rather secret. A lot of what the West knows about them is nothing but the presentable, pretty surface. These practices include certain rituals, chants, symbols, the channeling of deities, and in fact, even the physical manifestation of these deities. These things are done in private, under the guidance of a mentor, i.e. a Lama. There are extensive secret initiations, and the practitioner must place his full, unwavering trust into his Lama. The Lama at times might resort to rather peculiar or perhaps even oppressive means if he judges that this is what his student requires. No matter what, the student must trust the ways of his teacher. There is a rather interesting inversion of logic within Vajrayana Buddhism. Things that are considered bad in other schools, like attachment, for example, are sometimes fostered instead. The idea here is that instead of blindly avoiding these things because your tradition simply told you to, you instead embrace them and master them. Thus, you move faster down the path of enlightenment. As a very basic example, it is a much bigger feat of strength to experience addiction and beat it instead of never experiencing it at all and blindly running from it. Therefore, the upside of the Vajrayana school is that enlightenment can be achieved in one single lifetime. The downside is that this achievement is extremely difficult, and in many cases the student has to go through many unpleasant, painful things. It goes without saying that it is extremely difficult to put your life into the hands of another person. The achievement of this enlightenment in one single lifetime is an immensely difficult thing. It is the most difficult thing a practitioner can ever go through, but it is doable, according to the Vajrayana school. Unlike the Mahayana tradition, the practitioner here does not need to accumulate merit over several lifetimes. As we will see in the case of Milarepa today, even a mass murderer can achieve it. Tibet is of course the heart and soul of Vajrayana Buddhism. Let us recall that earlier in the video we spoke about the indigenous Tibetan religion of Bon, which also utilized various chants, symbols, and physical movements for the purposes of magic. These things were also taught to you by a teacher, a Lama. Milarepa had already gone through this process while learning the destructive arts. It is therefore not difficult at all to see how the arrival of Buddhism in Tibet and its confrontation with the local indigenous traditions resulted in the blooming of this esoteric magical school that Milarepa participated in. The Lama ideal and the various shamanistic elements only further added to what was already by this point a religion that placed great importance on meditative, enlightened experience. The only difference now was that instead of drawing symbols and chanting words for the purposes of summoning a storm, these rituals were done in order to keep proceeding down the path of enlightenment. Another aspect of Vajrayana Buddhism that is important to consider is its secrecy, and more specifically what this secrecy implies. First of all, the purpose of the secrecy surrounding its rituals is not due to some malicious desire to create an elite group of people in the know. The reality here is much simpler and not at all malicious. These teachings, were they made public, could have disastrous consequences if applied incorrectly, i.e. without the supervision of a Lama. The range of issues here is quite large. The practitioner could become confused and lost because he did not have someone check his understanding before he applied a certain ritual. The practitioner could channel the wrong spiritual deity at the wrong time and can easily become overwhelmed, especially if he is not adequately prepared for what seems to be a supernatural encounter. Not every tantra is applicable in every situation. And even if a tantra is correctly identified to be beneficial in some specific instance, there is no guarantee at all that this tantra will be executed correctly without the supervision of an experienced Lama. In short, one must not operate heavy machinery without the appropriate teaching, oversight, and license. Since Vajrayana Buddhism relies so much on secrecy and this Lama-student relationship, it goes without saying that the predominant way of sharing knowledge is through oral transmission. In the classical Buddhist scholarship, every teaching since the time of the Buddha himself was transmitted first through the word, and only later was codified by some scholar. This is akin to any ancient religion that stresses the importance of ancestral links and unbroken lineages. Milarepa, who is said to receive these teachings orally from Marpa, is just one link in a chain that can ultimately be traced back to Siddhartha Gautama himself, i.e. the first teacher, the Buddha Shakyamuni. Marpa received these teachings orally from his legendary masters in India, and those masters received them from their masters, and so on. This is also one of the reasons for the existence of the three major schools of Buddhism. The practitioners of Theravada Buddhism, for example, do not recognize the validity of some of these chains. They claim that some of these unbroken chains of oral transmission did not really happen, and thus they disavow the respective scripture that was codified later within the other schools. With this digression out of the way, let us now see how exactly these fundamentals manifested within the teaching approach of Marpa the Translator. All throughout the initial phases of Milarepa's study, he resorted to begging in the nearby villages for his food and clothing. From the supplies he would manage to gather, he would always set a portion aside as an offering to his Lama, as is in line with the student Lama tradition. Marpa, however, would constantly chastise him for doing so. What he gathered through begging was worthless to Marpa. He interpreted it as Milarepa trying to cozy up to him in order to get the teaching faster. In part, this was true. Milarepa was very anxious to get the teaching. Every time he would confess this to Marpa, Marpa would only laugh and ridicule him in return, saying that he is not worthy of the teaching due to the gravity of his sins. Instead, he was only worthy of being worked very hard, like a donkey or a laborer. Marpa's true intention behind this was of course to humble Milarepa, to reduce his ego as much as possible, to give him a first glimpse of the fact that even he himself is impermanent, and that he is nothing more than a collection of sentiments and physical sensations that differ in no fundamental way to the donkey and the laborer. In short, Milarepa had to be broken down fully so that Marpa could then properly rebuild him. The most famous story of Milarepa's hardships under Marpa has to do with the construction of a building. For a long time, Marpa had intended to construct a dwelling place on a nearby hill, the ownership of which was split between numerous cousins. For years they had bickered over who gets to build what on this hill, and Marpa finally decided to make his claim by erecting a building on the plot, regardless of how his cousins would react to this blatant act of initiative. Of course, Milarepa was charged with doing all of this intense labor. Milarepa was given his instructions on the first day of the project. He is to build a round tower. Milarepa immediately got to work. The work was hard. He had no assistance and had to lug each stone up the hill. He had to dig the foundations and then lay each piece one by one. The amount of physical effort required here was tenfold more than simply plowing the fields, and he of course still had to feed himself through daily tiresome begging as well. When the tower was half completed, Marpa came to check on Milarepa's work. The tidings were not very good. Marpa seemed unsatisfied. He looked at Milarepa and told him very frankly, "I did not consider the matter fully before assigning you this project. The tower is round, but I need it to be semicircular. Tear it all down and start again." Hardened by a life of hardship and seemingly pointless toil, Milarepa simply agreed and got back to work. He tore everything down that he had erected and began building a semicircular foundation. Once again, Marpa came to inspect his work when the tower was half completed. Again, he was not satisfied. "I was drunk when I asked you to build a semicircular tower. This is not what I truly want. Tear it all down and build me a triangular tower." Milarepa couldn't hold back his reaction this time. He exclaimed profusely, "Master, this back and forth is a waste of your wealth and a waste of my health. Please consider it carefully before I get back to work again. This is making me miserable." Marpa insisted, however. He claimed that he was very certain this time the triangular shape would be perfect. Milarepa took Marpa's word and got back to work yet again. Everything had to be torn down once more, every stone put back into a stack of building materials, and a new foundation sketched out. All of this was quite tiring, and Milarepa still hadn't received a single teaching. When the triangular tower was half completed, Marpa came for yet another inspection. His reaction was rather different this time. It was very peculiar. He asked Milarepa who exactly instructed him to build all of this. Why was he doing this? Marpa did not recall ever asking for a construction project in the first place. Milarepa could not believe his ears. He quickly recounted to Marpa how he had built 3 towers by this point, and that Marpa came every time and asked him to tear it all down and start again. Marpa was infuriated upon hearing Milarepa's answer, and he accused him of undermining his sanity, since he himself did not remember making any such requests. In his anger, he instructed Milarepa to tear it all down and carry every stone and piece of earth back to their place. He must restore the entire hill to its pristine, natural condition. If he does this job well, Marpa would reward him with his very first verbal teaching. If he does not do the job well, then Marpa never wants to see him again. He must pack up and leave forever. The small promise of his first teaching was enough to satiate Milarepa's despairing thirst. He immediately got back to work, and the hill was indeed restored to its pristine natural condition. While Milarepa slaved away putting everything back in its right place, Marpa's wife approached Marpa and made a positive appeal on Milarepa's behalf. Marpa was working the young man too much. The trick he just pulled on him was too severe, it was too harsh and confusing. She pleaded with her husband to show some compassion and not forget the sufferings Milarepa had already endured for countless years. Marpa indeed succumbed to the pleas of his wife, and this would not be the last time that Marpa's wife would step in for Milarepa in an attempt to reduce her husband's cruelty. In the classical tradition of recounting this story, she became a new mother to Milarepa, awfully reminiscent of the mother deity in Buddhism, Tara. Perhaps you have heard of the chant in her honor, Om Tare Tutare Ture Soha. The biographies of Milarepa are littered with such symbolic parallels. Every individual that had a positive effect on Milarepa's life has an analogous deity within the mythical Buddhist cosmology. When Milarepa returned from his work, Marpa called him for a private meeting. Here he gave Milarepa his first teaching. The basis of this teaching were the so-called 3 refuges, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Any practitioner is intimately familiar with all of this. These are the 3 jewels that a Buddhist honors and seeks refuge in all throughout the many hardships of his practice. Firstly, he is to place his trust in the Buddha as a man, and thus seek refuge from the world in his person. Secondly, he is to trust the path and the teaching itself, the Dharma. Good practice will therefore shelter him, once again, from the hardships of the world. Lastly, the practitioner is to place his trust in the Sangha. This is the Buddhist community. When the going gets rough, he can turn to his fellow brethren and thus find refuge. Marpa supplemented this basic teaching with his own stories and experience studying in India under great legendary masters. He expounded on the difficult path to liberation that his own teachers faced and how they gracefully overcame all obstacles. To finish the lesson off, he concluded, "This will be very difficult for you." Milarepa was overwhelmed with a renewed feeling of faith and joy. Despite this pleasant turn of events, Marpa was still determined to have a tower constructed. The following morning he came to Milarepa and told him of his new construction plans. He is to erect a square tower, 9 stories tall, with a beautiful pinnacled roof, making it 10 stories in total. After the completion of the tower, Marpa will provide him the true secret teaching of the Dharma, and Milarepa will then be able to retire for an extensive period of solitary meditation. As a guarantee of his word, Marpa agreed to have his wife act as a witness. If Marpa pulls any tricks again and has Milarepa destroy this new tower, the wife is to speak up and remind him of his guarantees. Thus, Milarepa got to work. Milarepa laid the foundations of this square tower. When he had completed the first 2 stories, some other disciples of Marpa came to see his work and assisted him by rolling a large boulder to complete a part of the tower. This was very hard work. Their strength, together, barely managed to move the boulder. Eventually, Marpa came to inspect Milarepa's work. Everything was to his liking, but the boulder was a point of concern. He asked Milarepa where this enormous boulder came from. Surely he did not roll it here himself. Milarepa told him the truth. 3 of his other disciples helped him. Marpa was not happy to hear this at all. This tower must be your own. Not one stone or piece of earth is to be put here by someone else. I order you to remove it immediately. Armed with his earlier guarantees, Milarepa argued back. With your wife as witness, you promised me that this tower would not be destroyed again, and yet here you are, asking me to destroy a significant section. Furthermore, the way this boulder was placed, I would have to demolish the tower in its entirety, lest it fall by itself without the support of this boulder. Weirdly enough, Marpa was not angered by this argument. He admitted indeed that he made promises to pull no tricks, but it is nevertheless important that no part of this tower be built by anybody else. His other disciples were at a different stage of learning, and it is bad practice for a Lama to confuse and mix different paths into one. Each student is to follow his own instructions and work independently. Thus, the tower had to come down after all. Milarepa mustered all of his faith and zeal and channeled it into rolling the boulder back. He dismantled the tower lest it fall without the support of the boulder and began setting a new foundation for the square tower. Yet, once again, Marpa showed up and gave instructions. I liked the boulder as part of the tower, I just didn't like how you placed it there. Roll it back again and use it as part of the foundation, but do this by yourself, with no outside help. Milarepa submitted and channeled all of his miseries into rolling this boulder back up the hill. Except for this boulder episode, the construction of the tower went along without issue. Milarepa had managed to build it 7 stories high. The work was hard and the reward non-existent. All that Milarepa had to show for himself was a destroyed back. It was covered in sores from lugging stones, the friction was rubbing it raw. An exposed, red, frail piece of starving flesh. As Milarepa continued to work daily on the tower, a certain famed disciple of another Lama came to Marpa in order to request initiation into a very specific tantra, i.e. he wanted to learn a specific set of words and physical rituals that his other Lama could not teach. Marpa's wife, sensing an opportunity for Milarepa, advised him to try and participate in this initiation. Surely, since Marpa was going to teach it anyway, there would be no harm in Milarepa observing on the class. Milarepa thus came to Marpa on the day of the teaching and prostrated before his master. As is customary for the student-Lama relationship, Marpa inquired as to what Milarepa would bring him as an offering. One does not receive initiation empty-handed. Very naturally, Milarepa pointed to the tower. Such a massive project, built for nobody but Marpa, is surely of more value than some fine fabrics or meat products that other students traditionally bring. As some of you can probably deduce by this point, this meant nothing to Marpa. He became infuriated and offended, saying that the tower is thinner than his own arm and it does not even begin to compare to the great secret teachings that Marpa tirelessly brought to Tibet from his legendary masters in India. Who does Milarepa think he is to equate a donkey's physical labor to this great, unbroken oral tradition of the Dharma? Saying this, Marpa slapped Milarepa across the face, grabbed him by the hair and threw him out of the house. Milarepa's words on this moment are quite touching indeed. Quote, "I wanted to die and wept the whole night." It was only Marpa's wife, in her motherly capacity, who took the time to console him that night and insisted that he stay persistent in his attempts to acquire the Dharma. The following day, Marpa came to Milarepa with a new set of instructions for his construction project. He asked that Milarepa take a pause with constructing the last remaining stories and instead build a new shrine room attached to the base of the tower. If he does this, his reward will be another teaching that Marpa will grant him, just as he did with the teaching of the 3 refuges. Milarepa had no choice but to get back to work. Time had passed and Milarepa made great progress on this shrine room. Marpa's wife, out of great compassion, sometimes came and gave Milarepa food and beer. He even had the opportunity to get quite drunk on a couple occasions, which certainly lifted his spirits. At some point, it happened that this famed disciple from earlier came back again. He needed another initiation for another specific tantra that none but Marpa could adequately teach. Once again, it was Marpa's wife who suggested that Milarepa try to participate in the initiation as well. Seeing that his offerings were ridiculed last time, Marpa's wife decided to give some actual physical things for Milarepa to offer for this initiation. It was some butter, fabrics, and a copper pot. Milarepa once again went to Marpa, prostrated before him, and presented his offerings. Once again, Marpa was infuriated. He told Milarepa that these offerings are worthless. He already had all of these items in his house. Other disciples had given them to him. Milarepa is to make a worthy offering or he is to leave. Again, Marpa followed this by hitting Milarepa and tossing him out of the house by his hair. Milarepa wept and once again wanted to die. He thought to himself that perhaps he will never be able to atone for his sins. They were far too great. Too many people had been killed, and so many had starved due to the hailstorm he summoned on his village's crops. If his sins are far too great to ever be able to even receive the Dharma, then of what use is his life? Of what use is a body that cannot practice religion? Milarepa seriously considered ending his life that night. If not for Marpa's compassionate wife, perhaps Milarepa wouldn't have lived long enough for this tale to ever be told. She snuck out to him a piece of cake and consoled him that entire evening as he wept uncontrollably. His sadness was so great that he did not even eat the cake and instead starved all through the night. That very next morning, Marpa came to Milarepa again and instructed him to finish off the shrine room. He also has to finish off the tower as a whole. If he does this, he will then receive the teaching. Again, Milarepa got to work. By this point, Milarepa did not believe that he would receive the teaching at all, but when faced with the choice between slight possibility or death, perhaps it is better to hold out a little while longer. Thus, Milarepa finished building the shrine room. By the time that Milarepa was done, his already raw back was completely destroyed. It was covered in blisters and open wounds. It was dirty, tender, and bright red. An infection was only waiting to happen. Concerned for the state of Milarepa's back, Marpa's wife came to the Lama and expressed her most profound desire that he finally show some compassion and give the young man what he seeks most, i.e. the full and proper teaching of the Dharma. But Marpa stood his ground. There would be no teaching until the entire tower is finished. Still, however, Marpa wanted to examine Milarepa's back, just to confirm that he is indeed risking his health and not simply crying into his wife's compassionate ear. His wife brought Milarepa and revealed his back, but after a lengthy inspection, Marpa only responded that his own masters in India had been through much worse. And on top of that, they never cried, they never faltered under the weight of their own suffering. What Marpa could do here at most is give Milarepa a set of clean towels to keep his back protected. Otherwise, the conditions remained the same. The tower must be completed before any further teaching can take place. It is important to point out that even though Marpa was utterly relentless in his disregard of Milarepa, in his thoughts he was very much amazed. In fact, he even shed tears in private at just how dedicated Milarepa was to this path. His submission to everything that I command is extraordinary. It goes without saying that a few clean towels did Milarepa very little good. In a short amount of time, the wounds on his back got infected. They leaked with pus and blood. They hurt just as much as a knife wound. And Milarepa spent days battling a most severe fever while continuing to build the tower every single day. Marpa's wife stepped in on his behalf yet again and asked Marpa to share his teaching, or at least allow Milarepa some days to rest and recover lest he die out there in the Tibetan sun. Marpa still insisted. Until the tower is done, there is nothing I can do. Marpa's wife had generally become very invested in Milarepa's fate. She went as far as to share some of her own teachings with him, certain meditation techniques primarily. Milarepa felt a great sense of appreciation for Marpa's wife, and her meditation did bring him some serenity, but ultimately he still felt no inner experience. The weight of his sins and his craving for the teaching continued to oppress him. It was at this time that Milarepa began to consider finding another Lama. Of course, no Lama was as great as Marpa, and the results would be slower, much less effective, but some results are better than no results at all. Most likely, he would never even reach enlightenment without Marpa, but at least the weight of his sins would be lifted just enough for him to be able to live out the rest of his days. As Milarepa weighed his options and considered leaving, another set of disciples came to Marpa yet again for another initiation into a highly specific tantra. Again, Marpa's wife suggested that Milarepa make some offering and try to receive the teaching as well. This time, Milarepa should offer something that is of extreme value, an item of wealth that Marpa surely would appreciate. The wife therefore gave Milarepa a large, expensive nugget of turquoise as an offering. Milarepa came to Marpa, prostrated himself, and gave this beautiful stone to his master. He begged unceasingly for the teaching. Impressed by the stone, Marpa simply asked, "Where did you get this from?" In order to avoid the sin of lying, especially to one's master, Milarepa told the truth, that he had received it from Marpa's wife, and thus Marpa turned to her and asked her the same question, "Where did you get this from?" Marpa's wife revealed that this was a gift from her parents on the occasion of their wedding. Were the marriage to fail, she could sell the stone and use the money to survive for some time while she seeks a new husband to take care of her. Marpa's face grew terrifying. Every disciple in the room got down on the floor and began to pray for his compassion. Through the good offices of my wife, this fine turquoise nearly fell into the hands of a stranger. Marpa turned to his wife and continued, "Fine woman, you do not think. Now as for the young man, if you have any wealth of your own, bring it and I will initiate you. Otherwise, leave." Milarepa did not move. Furious over this display of disobedience, Marpa beat him senselessly. Milarepa lost consciousness as his head hit the ground. The entire room began to weep. When Milarepa opened his eyes, he scurried out of the room and cried the whole night, pondering on death yet again. Marpa's wife came to him and told him very frankly, "You may have to seek another Lama." That morning, the Lama sent for Milarepa and interrogated him as to how he feels. Milarepa was very honest. He still had some faith in Marpa. He is aware that he is only receiving what he deserves on account of his sins, and for this reason he has never rebelled in any significant fashion. As he said these things, he began to cry. Yet again, Marpa was vicious. "What do you expect to gain from me by these tears? Get out of my house." It was at this moment that Milarepa finally made the decision to abandon Marpa. This would be the first, but not the last time that he abandons him. He quickly gathered the few books he had and left the house without saying goodbye to neither Marpa nor his wife. Milarepa walked for half a day before he stopped to have a meal. He begged for some food and a pot to cook it in from the locals, and an old man gave him both. As he ate this meal, he was suddenly overcome with thoughts about Marpa's wife, how she used to sneak him food and beer during his work on the tower. A sense of guilt crept into his heart. He did not even thank her, nor did he wish her farewell. On top of this, he abandoned his master, to whom he also never said goodbye. Milarepa felt like a rude and evil man. Perhaps simply out of respect, he should go back and make his proper goodbyes. When he returned the pot that he borrowed from the old man, this old man struck up a conversation with him and came to learn that Milarepa was educated, i.e. he could read. The old man had some money to spare and had been looking for somebody to read Buddhist prayers to him, and thus Milarepa unexpectedly gained employment, if only for a short time. Milarepa felt happy about this sudden change in his circumstances. He sat with the old man in his home and read numerous Buddhist texts out loud. Among these texts was the story of Nagarjuna, a figure most important and influential to the Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhist schools. In this story, he saw that Nagarjuna was a bodhisattva. He gave his life and body to his religion while living in absolute poverty. Nagarjuna was the sort of man who would have happily torn out his own heart and cut it into pieces for the benefit of his religion. In the classic Tibetan retelling of Nagarjuna's life, he committed indirect suicide in order to save another man, a young prince. Nagarjuna offered himself up to be killed. Comparing to Nagarjuna's self-sacrifice, Milarepa had given absolutely nothing in the name of his religion. His awareness of this gave him the final bit of motivation to return to Marpa and pay a respectful goodbye. As long as Marpa does not kill him, his fate would always be much better than that of the great Nagarjuna. Back home, Marpa was privately despairing over the fact that Milarepa had left. He cried and prayed to his guardian deities that they bring back his predestined son. In the midst of all this crying, Milarepa showed up at his door. Marpa's wife was overjoyed and immediately brought him before her husband. As soon as Marpa saw him, he felt relief and assumed the role of Lama again. He told Milarepa that if he truly yearns for the teaching, then he will get it, but he must still complete the tower. Milarepa had absolutely nothing to say in response, and so he left to his old room. In this room, Marpa's wife joined him. He told her that even though he has returned, he is still full of doubt. Marpa's insistence that he must finish the tower upsets him, and he is even more scared that Marpa will pull yet another trick and not give him the teaching after all of his hard work. To his surprise, the wife agreed. Her husband was unpredictable, and she feels so much pity and compassion for Milarepa that she thinks it would be best for him to seek another teacher. She quickly wrote a letter of recommendation to Lama Ngokpa, who wasn't too far away, and signed it in Marpa's name, with his seal. She then gave Milarepa some items of great value as an offering and told him to seek his teaching elsewhere. Perhaps one day he could return to Marpa as a man further down the Enlightenment path, and thus he could gain his respect as a person worthy of advanced initiation. For now, however, a fake letter of recommendation will have to suffice. And so Milarepa departed once again, this time uninhibited by feelings of guilt and remorse toward abandoning Marpa. The great Lama Ngokpa would finally help him. It took Milarepa 2 days to find Lama Ngokpa. He caught him right in the middle of a teaching. Milarepa prostrated himself at a distance and continued to listen until the Lama noticed him. Lama Ngokpa remarked that this way of greeting a Lama is common to students of Marpa, and that Milarepa arrived at a perfect moment in his lesson. The part of the class he disrupted made for a very good omen. This young man will go on to be a master of every doctrine. The Lama sent his monks to find out who exactly this young man was. Milarepa introduced himself to the monks and joined the procession they formed to approach Lama Ngokpa. He gave his fake letter of recommendation, and the Lama thus agreed to take him in. Milarepa meditated and learned certain rituals under his new teacher, but as he says himself, he gained no inner experience, since he abandoned his rightful master, Marpa. No other man or woman could have ever given him the true Dharma in a form that was suitable for him specifically. As Lama Ngokpa observed Milarepa's progress, he began to grow quite suspicious. Some parts of his story were not adding up. Marpa was a superior Lama in every sense, and all of a sudden, without rhyme or reason, he permanently relocates his disciple to Lama Ngokpa, with offerings of very great worth. This was certainly unprecedented. However, Milarepa was a good student, and for some time Lama Ngokpa let all of this confusion slide. Meanwhile, Marpa took it upon himself to finish the tower that Milarepa was building. His son's coming-of-age celebration was forthcoming, and the tower for him to dwell and pray in would make for a very fitting gift on such an important occasion. We do not know how long it took him to finish the tower, but that day did eventually come, and Marpa sent a letter to all the local lamas to come for the unveiling of the finished building and to celebrate his son's birthday as well. All of his invitations were the same, but the one intended for Lama Ngokpa had an additional sentence at the end. "Bring with you a certain evildoer that still belongs to me." This only confirmed Lama Ngokpa's growing suspicions. He confronted Milarepa with the letter, and Milarepa told him the whole truth, of how Marpa gave him no teaching, of how he worked him to death, and how Marpa's wife wrote a fake letter of recommendation on Marpa's behalf. This deceit was unacceptable to Lama Ngokpa, and he immediately ended their relationship. He would write no letter of recommendation. Milarepa is either to return to Marpa or to find a new Lama on his own, without anything of value to offer for the teaching. But Milarepa was intent on receiving the teaching. Thus, he would have to go back to Marpa. He was truly left with no other choice. It is at this point, however, that Milarepa's tide finally began to turn. Upon his arrival at Marpa's house, the atmosphere was tangibly different. Milarepa expected Marpa to be furious. Not only did Milarepa abandon him again, he also took items of great value from his house as offerings to another Lama. He had nothing to offer to Marpa either. He was returning empty-handed, and he truly thought that Marpa would immediately reject him. The tower that Milarepa was meant to complete was finished by Marpa himself. He got Marpa's wife into hot water even though she was only trying to help, and he still felt that his sins had simply been too severe to ever redeem. For all intents and purposes, this return was nothing more than a rejected, beaten down, fragile young man going to the only place he's known for 6 years. Marpa would reject him again, and by that point Milarepa would have no choice but to simply end his own life. The weight of his sins would thus finally defeat him. And yet, this is exactly the mental state that Marpa wanted to instill in his most promising disciple. He wanted Milarepa to face a mountain of rejections. He wanted Milarepa to feel that he has nothing of himself left to give, to crush him down entirely so that he can be rebuilt. His tireless work on the towers, his ensuing illness from infection, his relentless rejection at every step of the process, this was enough to atone for his sins, to clear his karma. This new Milarepa, exhausted and destroyed, was no longer capable of committing those prior sins. His focus was now purely on his own suffering and remorse. He would never lift his arm again to cast destructive spells. Milarepa was simply in far too much personal pain to ever consider inflicting pain on others. Rejection after rejection finally meant that his humility was complete. He thought of himself as nothing of value, just another individual in great suffering, in rightful suffering. What seemed as total cruelty and abuse on behalf of Marpa was in fact his teaching all along. Milarepa was now aware of the pain that he had inflicted on others and how difficult it is to shed all of this suffering, whether you are a victim or a perpetrator. Considering the fragile state of Milarepa's mind and that he had been pushed to his utmost limits, and we always underestimate our limits, it was now time to rebuild through compassion. At the birthday feast of Marpa's son, which is a great and symbolic occasion, Marpa finally revealed his truth to this most promising disciple and spiritual son. Marpa revealed to Milarepa how his coming was prophesied in a dream. As we saw a while ago, Marpa was commanded in a dream to receive a holy object and fix its imperfections, and then consecrate it for the entire world to see. Marpa finally admitted that he did indeed pull tricks on Milarepa during the construction of the tower. This constant building and rebuilding was a lesson on not only impermanence, but also just how much toil and suffering can go into creating anything at all. Much like the path to enlightenment itself, and as Milarepa's journey has shown thus far, a lot of time can be spent backpedaling, doing things pointlessly and mindlessly, and even the best intentions can be undermined and destroyed within one single day. Pain of the body is no great obstacle to one who truly wishes to pursue the Dharma. Every legendary master had at some point underwent great suffering for his belief, whether it be the self-sacrifice of Nagarjuna or even the period of strict asceticism that the Buddha himself underwent. At the height of his back pain and the infection, Milarepa still made his best effort, drowning in pain and despair. This was a price worthy of paying when it comes to the sacred Dharma. Through a series of mental deaths, Milarepa had finally purified himself. His body was now ready to receive the holiest of the holy from the great Marpa Lotsawa. Thus, on this fateful day, after close to 2 decades of suffering following the death of his father, Milarepa was finally initiated into the Dharma. From this point onwards, Milarepa would spend the remainder of his life in prolonged periods of meditation. The longest meditative period that Milarepa spent lasted 12 years in a cave. This is the main retreat that is so important to his image as a meditating Buddhist practitioner. And in some cases, people think that this was his only meditation, that his biography followed a very episodic nature of sin, initiation, meditation, and then everything after this one long period. But this is not really the case. Meditation became the lighthouse of Milarepa's life. He returned to it constantly. He recommended it to everybody as part of a consistent regimen, and we could go as far as to say that meditation was the bare minimum of Buddhist practice in Milarepa's eyes. As we say in Russian, it was his pendulum, i.e., meditation was always at the center, the original position from which one can swing each and every way. We will talk about this in more detail in a little while. Our second act concluded with Marpa giving Milarepa the secret teaching of his own legendary Indian masters, and he thus instructed Milarepa to seek seclusion, to isolate himself in the Tiger Neck cave and meditate upon everything that he has learned. Theory is pointless after all if it cannot be absorbed and felt in every cell of one's body through practice. With ample supplies, Milarepa embarked on his first seclusion. He walled off the cave to prevent any interruptions from passers-by, and he then spent 11 months in total isolation, meditating daily. Lending to the secretive nature of Vajrayana Buddhism that we spoke about earlier, there is not very much that we can ever know about what precisely it was that Milarepa was supposed to meditate on during these 11 months. What we know simply is that Milarepa practiced the secret tantric techniques that Marpa taught him, and he gained insight into the Buddhist notion of emptiness, or sunyata. This is a core teaching of Mahayana Buddhism that you surely have heard of before, the very famous quote, "Form is emptiness and emptiness is form." This comes from the Heart Sutra, the heart of the perfection of wisdom. There exist countless resources for you to consult on this matter if you are interested. In short, emptiness, or sunyata, refers to the notion that all things lack inherent, independent existence. No single phenomenon in the universe has some permanent core. Everything is dependent on something else, and it comes about as a result of something else. This something else is also empty of permanent existence, since something else caused it in the first place. This recurs forever. If we eliminate every process that creates or destroys something else, we will ultimately be left with nothing. Emptiness. There are two stages to this insight. The first stage is the so-called conventional stage, or conventional truth. One must simply understand that every phenomenon has a cause and would never occur without this cause. And so observable life, with all of its feelings, objects, and happenings, is nothing but a continuous chain of cause and effect. Awareness of this fact does not negate the world, but merely shifts one's perspectives and reactions to his various daily impressions. The second stage, the so-called absolute stage or absolute truth, is the ensuing understanding that since everything in life is nothing but a continuous chain of cause and effect, then all of it, quite simply, does not really exist. If everything is ultimately empty of independent existence and is only shaped by this eternally unchanging process of cause and effect, then nothing truly exists. Thus, the nature of reality is a fundamental emptiness. If one were to violently cut into the process of cause and effect and stop it, emptiness is all that would remain. This is sunyata. This is a very short summation, and it is still burdened by our tendency to think of nothingness as something. The same way we denote the lack of objects by the number 0, or the emptiness of a room as some specific space that is not occupied by furniture. This immediately turns it into something. Even if this something is empty, we are still denoting it with a concept. A true insight into sunyata would thus require the practitioner to abandon all conventions of language and feel things for what they ultimately are, before they are conceptualized as words and thus made into concrete mental notions. Whenever you come across the Buddhist term non-conceptual mind, this is precisely what is meant. A mind that is free from the shackles of language and convention, that does not feel the need to conceptualize and make concrete that which is empty in its core, that which has no core at all. Every individual of renown within the Buddhist tradition was able to achieve such a state. To some, myself included, emptiness is the most important and difficult notion within the entire Buddhist school of thought. It is found in very primitive form at the very foundations of early Buddhism, and in its unrefined form can even be found in the ancient Greek philosopher Pyrrho, after his tenure in India under Alexander the Great. But this is a video for another time. Milarepa's insight into the emptiness of all things, as well as the general tenets of the Enlightenment path, were beautifully outlined by Milarepa at the end of his very first prolonged meditation retreat. Following these 11 months, Marpa's wife came to the cave of Tiger Neck and told Milarepa that his master is summoning him for a feast. He wishes to hear of Milarepa's progress. Of course, in full submission to his Lama, Milarepa journeyed to Marpa's house and reported on his progress. This was done in the form of song. We must recall at this point that as a youth, Milarepa was celebrated for his beautiful voice and his ability to compose beautiful lyrics. In fact, Milarepa's primary teachings survive in the form of songs. There is a supplementary body of literature to his biography entitled The 100,000 Songs of Milarepa, through which Milarepa continues to teach to this very day. Thus, Milarepa sang the Song of the Sevenfold Devotions to his master, a lyrical summation of his insights so far. In this song, Milarepa states very clearly that the Dharma is a clear and lucid teaching. It has none of the impurities that we suffer in regular life. And yet the Dharma is life itself. Therefore, to a lucid mind, life itself is of no fundamental impurities. As we just said, it is emptiness, clear and lucid emptiness. Within this clear and lucid emptiness, Milarepa offers his gratitudes and utmost respect to his Lama, who has set him on the path of atonement, who was the key to all of his insights. Milarepa sang his wish that the supremely perfect Lama may live so long as there are other sentient beings enmeshed in samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. Following this song, Milarepa returned to normal speech and continued reporting on his insights. During his meditation, he came to understand that the material body, alongside mental consciousness as yet another part of this material body, is gathered together by cause and effect. One aspect of cause and effect is volition, i.e. the human faculty of using one's will, deciding what to do and how to do it. And this aspect finds most of its motivations in ignorance. One acts a certain way because he is ignorant of the consequences of his actions, and when he comes to suffer these consequences, he acts again out of desperation, and thus he keeps himself permanently tangled within this series of confusions and pain. In Milarepa's own words, this body is the blessed vessel for those fortunate beings who wish for freedom. But it is also the vessel for sinners who lead themselves further and further into the sinful lower realms. Having gleaned this truth, Milarepa hopes to use his body to achieve liberation from the ocean of existential bondage, to act in a compassionate way that prevents himself and others from performing acts that confuse, hurt, and further entrench painful causes with their painful effects. Having first sought refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, Milarepa came to understand that the source of all happiness is the Lama, and therefore the first principle of practice is to fulfill each and every instruction of one's Lama, and to maintain an unblemished spiritual bond with him. It is the Lama who will guide his student to achieve a very difficult state, a fortunate human existence. He arouses the student's mind with great intensity regarding impermanence and death, the consequences of action, and the pain of ceaseless rebirth. He makes the student wish for liberation and enforces that he pursues it in accordance with moral precepts. These moral precepts stem from an understanding of how much every sentient being suffers without guidance. Marpa instilled this in Milarepa all throughout those most severe years of rejection and physical labor. Milarepa came to him with an existing longing for liberation, but the liberation he wanted was only from his personal remorse. Marpa pushed this to its natural conclusion. Milarepa desired liberation from suffering in its entirety. During his meditation, Milarepa also understood the progression for one's liberation. One must begin on the lesser vehicle. As we saw earlier, the lesser vehicle focuses on personal enlightenment for the benefit of the lone practitioner. This is the initial push. One's personal suffering is too great to consider the benefit of anybody else. This is only natural. However, as you journey down this path, you come to realize that since the true nature of reality is the same for every other sentient being, it would be unfair to achieve personal enlightenment and leave other beings behind. It is only due to these beings that you could exist in the first place. Dozens of individuals all participate in the cultivation of the food you eat, in the production of the objects you buy and sell, in the construction of shelters and so on. Even the creation of this video is made possible by thousands of people having worked on the platform where it is published. All of these thousands of people also suffer. Therefore, you pivot onto the greater vehicle path, which tends as closely as possible to personal enlightenment but stops short in order to assist all the other beings. On a very large scale, this is a bodhisattva to whom the entirety of mankind looks for guidance. On the smallest scale, however, this is a Lama who takes the time and effort to guide his own students, as Marpa did for Milarepa. Milarepa continues here. Meditation allows one to understand that his personality does not exist. It is once again dictated by external causes, ranging from environment to food and to the people around you. One's preferences for music, for example, are most often influenced by the tastes of the parents. It is very likely that some of the music you like you first heard in the comfort of your childhood routine. Preferences for food are dictated by the culture that one is raised in. As a personal example, living as an expat for a majority of my life, I often find myself despairing due to how much I miss the food of my childhood, the food of a nation that I no longer live in. Everything follows this principle. Once the practitioner understands that his personality is dictated by certain causes, he can apply principles of logic to come to the rather radical conclusion that selfhood as a whole does not exist. In very plain, frank terms, you yourself do not exist. You are sunyata. You are emptiness, since everything that defines you is empty of selfhood as well. Consequently, as we already stated, the mind reaches a non-conceptual state and stops recognizing the passage of time. It stops recognizing physical space, and therefore achieves tranquility proper. This state must be maintained and cultivated for the remainder of the practitioner's life through a strict, dedicated regimen of meditation. This flash of perfect insight, known as pure consciousness, is to be imparted on all sentient beings out of compassion. I will let Milarepa conclude here in his own words. To sum up, first, a vivid state of mental tranquility and sustaining energy, together with a discerning intellect, are indispensable requirements for attaining perfect insight. They are like the first steps of a staircase. Second, all meditation, with or without form, must begin from deeply aroused compassion and love. Whatever one does must emerge from a loving attitude for the benefit of others. Third, through perfect seeing, all seeing and understanding is dissolved into a non-conceptual state. Finally, with an awareness of the void, one sincerely dedicates the results for the benefit of others. I have understood this to be the best of all ways. Just as a starving man cannot be fed by the knowledge of food but needs to eat, so too one needs to experience in meditation the meaning of emptiness. I understand more particularly that in order to arrive at perfect insight, it is necessary to practice good deeds and self-purification from negative karma and mental states, without respite, in the intervals between meditations. In short, I understood that my understanding of the emptiness of things, of their unity, of their indefinability, and of their non-differentiation corresponds perfectly to the Vajrayana teaching. I have manifested this knowledge by subduing my body, depriving it of food, harnessing my mind, and I have therefore achieved tranquility in the face of all circumstances, including the danger of death. Milarepa then sung his final point. May the fruits of my meditation be profitable to all beings, in striving toward the limits of perfection. Hearing all of this, Marpa and his wife were filled with utmost assurance that Milarepa had finally grasped the path, and he will go on to make it manifest. The Lama had therefore successfully sown the seeds of an eternal saint. Milarepa retreated back to his cave after revealing his insights to Marpa and continued to meditate for several years. The cave was not too far from Marpa's house, and so his meditation would be interrupted every now and then by a visit to Marpa's for further reporting and advice. As far as Marpa was concerned, this was his true spiritual heir, a son who occasionally came to visit his parents as he navigated his own adult life and built something of his own. Marpa's own biological son had died at some point during Milarepa's meditations, and so the prophecy came true. Marpa would have no living descendant, but would make up for this tenfold through a disciple. This relationship was reciprocal for Milarepa. His real father had passed away so many years prior, and he had no knowledge of the affairs of his remaining family members. It had been years since he last heard from his mother and his sister, and frankly, he had not thought of them much either. Only liberation was on his mind, and everything that came with it. However, this was about to change. At some point during his meditation, Milarepa had a most unsettling dream. He dreamt of his village, Kyangatsa, that he had returned to it. He saw his childhood home. It was in a state of disrepair. The roof had caved in. Rain had damaged the interior. The sacred books of the library grew moldy and infested with silverfish. Their field was overrun with weeds and dead crop. His beloved, suffering mother was dead. Her skeleton lied in the living room. Her entire side of the family was also long gone. His sister was nowhere to be seen. The villagers in his dream claimed that she resorted to a life of begging. She had no permanent shelter nor food. Milarepa observed all of this and wept from sorrow. He woke up from this dream with tears running down his cheeks. The pain of the dream was acute and far too distracting to meditate. He tore down the entrance of his cave and went to see his master. Marpa was asleep when Milarepa arrived. He woke him up by singing, "O Master, Buddha immutable, send this poor student to his homeland in the valley of Kyangatsa. Mother and children, hated by our relatives, we have been separated for so long. My love can no longer endure this separation. Let me see my mother just once more, and I will return without delay." Marpa awoke to the song and immediately interrogated Milarepa as to why he broke the strict rules of his seclusion. Breaking the meditation without being summoned by Marpa places his entire practice in danger. He must immediately return to his cave. But Milarepa insisted. He told him of the dream he had and that he wants to return home to see whether any of this dream was actually true. He insisted also that he would return quickly. He simply cannot continue his practice without pacifying this intensely painful desire. Surprisingly, Marpa agreed, but this did not come without consequences. Marpa told him directly, "The fact that I did not foresee your coming and that you found me asleep is an omen. If you undertake this journey, we will never see each other again. And yet, as the sun falls through the window, it is evident that you will make the Buddha's teachings shine splendidly. You will spread the teaching far and wide. It is time for me to let you go." Evidently, Marpa saw value in Milarepa undertaking this trip. In the case that the dream was nothing but a dream, Milarepa will see that nothing has changed back home. There was no need to break his practice. He must get back as soon as possible and avoid future distractions. However, in the case that the dream was prophetic, Milarepa will experience pain, and this pain will propel him down the path to enlightenment. He will once again see the dangers of attachment, that nothing is permanent, that he is not in control of whether his mother lives or dies. Having once again gained insight into the nature of reality through a personal, painful example, this will only benefit his practice. And so Marpa prepared for Milarepa's departure. They spent several days going over the final parts of the teaching. Everything that Marpa planned to slowly reveal to Milarepa was instead delivered on an accelerated program. This includes the final part of his teaching, that Milarepa himself will one day bear responsibility for spreading Marpa's teaching. He will have to be very careful. If he sells these teachings for material gain, he will incur the wrath of many deities. This teaching is not intended for every undisciplined mind. Just as Marpa made sure to create the perfect mental conditions for Milarepa to become fully receptive, so will Milarepa have to ensure the quality of his own students. He is to guard the teaching and mold it into perfect forms for every promising disciple. It was following these words that Marpa finally showed his true capabilities to his spiritual heir. He transformed into numerous forms. He made himself into various symbols: the sword, the bell, the wheel, and the lotus. He turned his body into 3 sacred letters: Om, A, and Hum. He then shone with white, red, and blue. His body then reached the ultimate form. He became a sphere of every visible and invisible light in the world. He was thus, in that moment, the living Buddha. This power of physical transformation and ultimate manifestation was what Milarepa was to strive for through a life of meditation. Marpa returned to his human form and gave Milarepa a list of places that he must meditate in. He also gave a list of places that Milarepa's disciples must meditate in when the time comes. Marpa's eyes were filled with tears and his heart with pride. With a final reminder of the impermanence of all things and the importance of meditation, Marpa parted with his spiritual son forever. They sang for each other a song of love and gratitude, a song of good tidings. Milarepa profusely thanked his adoptive mother, Marpa's wife, for everything that she ever did, for all those moments of compassion that saved his life during Marpa's cruelty. The 3 of them together shed many tears, had one last warm embrace, and Milarepa began his journey back home. His 2 spiritual parents watched his silhouette blend with the horizon. They would never see Milarepa again. Marpa retired and lived another 11 years, overjoyed by the forthcoming results of his spiritual mission. He passed away while Milarepa meditated in this long list of caves. Milarepa's dream turned out to be true. His house was indeed in disarray. His mother did in fact pass away years ago. His sister was long lost. She lived the life of a beggar. His family's sacred books were destroyed by the rain. Nothing really remained of the once renowned Mila family. Not recognizing Milarepa, the local herdsman said that the son disappeared a very long time ago after causing a lot of misfortune. Nobody ever really bothered to find out what happened to him. His name was both hated and feared by the locals. Marpa was completely correct in his prediction. This would be a very valuable lesson for Milarepa. Overcome with sorrow, he sat in this dark and moldy living room of his once great house, and he wept. He was overwhelmed by the futility of life, just how easy it is to get attached and how easy it is to lose everything that you got attached to. He looked at the bones of his mother, which had been untouched ever since she died in this broken house, and Milarepa began to quietly sing. In his song, he thanked Marpa for allowing him to experience this lesson. Marpa's predictions were correct. The Lama always knows best, and the Lama always foresees things far beyond the capabilities of his disciple. Milarepa sang on the futility of existence. Everything that exists is transitory and in constant movement. Everything is devoid of essential purpose and value. He must therefore devote himself entirely to the Dharma and liberate every being he can from this painful existence. This song, the Song of Equanimity, is perhaps the most emblematic out of Milarepa's repertoire. He sings on his own childhood. At first, when there was a father, there was no son. When there was a son, there was no longer a father. Our meeting was illusion. Likewise, he sings on his mother. When there was a mother, there was no son. Now that I have come back, my old mother is dead. Our meeting was illusion. Milarepa sang the same words for his sister, who was now forced to wander just as Milarepa had wandered while she stayed behind at the uncle's farm. He even sang a song for his damaged books. When there were holy books, I did not venerate them. Now that I do venerate them, they are damaged and destroyed by the rain. Our meeting was illusion. He sang the same words for his house and for his dead field. Every time he sang these words, he finished off the verse by repeating, I, son, will practice the true Dharma. I go now to meditate at Horsetooth White Rock. Milarepa finished his song with a final verse. House, homeland, and fields are a world without true benefit. Let the ignorant take them. As a hermit, I go to seek liberation. Compassionate Father, Marpa the Translator, bless this man so that he may meditate in solitude. With these words, Milarepa decided once and for all that he will seek solitude and strive for nothing but the Dharma. He gathered whatever provisions remained and set out to meditate in every cave that Marpa had listed for him. Milarepa's journey lasted several months, mainly due to the fact that he stopped in every cave on the way to ensure the continuation of his meditative regime. Every cave he came across, he spent more and more time in. His meditation was going quite flawlessly. However, his supplies were not infinite. Within some months, he ran out of food. Having no other way of sustaining himself, Milarepa was forced to beg along his journey between the caves. There is nothing particularly strange about this set of circumstances. All Buddhist monks rely on the generosity of their neighbors to feed themselves. It was during this time, however, that Milarepa had a most peculiar encounter. He ran into his aunt. This is the very same aunt that took everything from him, that caused this entire series of events. The aunt that never stopped her husband from delivering endless harm and cruelty to the Mila family. This is exactly how it went. Milarepa found it quite effective to beg from various herdsmen in the mountains during the winter, and he would beg from villagers in the valley during the summer. Every time he saw a tent, he would go and ask for milk. The herdsmen always had a very decent supply from their cattle and very happily shared their resources in return for a moment of wisdom from Milarepa. One day he saw yet another tent and decided to approach it and make his usual requests. Milarepa got on the ground before the entrance to the tent and began to beg politely, but the response was a fierce shouting and yelling. The person inside the tent cursed him out and threatened to set their dogs on him. As Milarepa looked up, he saw the aged, furious face of his aunt. His heart sank to his stomach. She began throwing stones at him and cursing his name. Milarepa tried to get up, but he was too weak. He had been starving for too long. He tripped and fell into a puddle and hit his head on a stone. Immediately, he broke into uncontrollable tears and cried out for Marpa to come and save him. Physically speaking, he was too weak to defend himself, and this blow to the head surely would not help. Strangely enough, his crying quickly turned into a song through which Milarepa tried to soothe himself while the aunt launched stones and insults at him, shooing him away from her tent. But this did not last much longer. As Milarepa wept and sang, a great sense of shame filled his aunt's heart. She went quiet and stopped throwing stones at him. Milarepa all the while continued to sing. There was definitely something magical about Milarepa's singing. Our story today is already very long, and his songs are far too numerous for us to dissect one by one, especially all of those that were intended as lessons in the later years of his life. And so I strongly urge you to take the time for yourself and read the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa. All that I will point out here is that his singing always had a positive, beneficial effect, perhaps from years of studying mantras under various teachers and from the holy books. He managed to perfectly manifest the teaching of the Dharma into his own lyrics. As we saw, his singing managed to convince Marpa to let him leave in the first place, and now, in this case, it managed to fill his aunt's heart with a great sense of shame. She succumbed to this sense of shame, stopped her shouting, and gave Milarepa the provisions he needed. He could now safely continue on his journey. Unfortunately for Milarepa, however, this would not be his last encounter with this treacherous family. Milarepa continued to meditate and beg. The summer had come. He was now begging in the village, door to door. He had learned from the villagers that his primary source of pain, his uncle, was also staying in this village. So far, he had managed to avoid him. He went door to door whenever he needed supplies, but did not happen upon his uncle just yet. It goes without saying that this would not last forever. It is important to note here that Buddhist monks, regardless of which school they belong to, are not allowed to discriminate in their begging. Simply put, beggars can't be choosers. If a monk decides to beg in a village, he is to methodically approach every household, whether rich or poor, and ask for assistance. In this way, all human beings of every class have a chance to participate in the Dharma, to do a good deed for the monks. And so, eventually, the uncle got to participate in the Dharma as well. One morning, while begging, Milarepa chanced upon his uncle's house. It was bound to happen eventually. His uncle's reaction was identical to that of the aunt. He began cursing at him, yelling and throwing stones. Milarepa immediately ran away. The uncle did not give up. In fact, he began rallying villagers to join him in his hunt after Milarepa. He shouted to every person he passed to prepare their bows and arrows, that the source of their misery was here. Milarepa, who all those years ago destroyed their crops through black magic and had also murdered some of their family members. This rallying cry was effective. Many of the villagers began to arm themselves and followed the chase. Milarepa appeared to be certainly doomed. It is an unfortunate reality of the world that sometimes, in order to prevent violence, one has to use an even bigger threat of violence. Finding a spot from where his voice could be heard, Milarepa stopped and turned around. He cleared his throat and announced loudly that if the villagers do not stop chasing him immediately, he will remind them as to why they hate him in the first place. He has not forgotten his black magic and is willing to use it for his own safety. This threat worked perfectly. The villagers, in a state of fear, put down their weapons and prostrated before Milarepa, crying for his forgiveness. It was only the uncle that remained silent. Milarepa took the opportunity to run even further, and the mob eventually dispersed. Unfortunately, our tale today has no satisfying reconciliation here. This was the last time that Milarepa would ever see his uncle. The aunt, however, is a different case. Milarepa took up a cave not too far from the village and once again focused on maintaining his meditation regimen. As much as he tried, however, he could not focus properly. He was profoundly disturbed by how he was chased out of the village, how he had to utilize a threat of violence to save himself, when instead he should have simply been abiding by the Dharma in order to save other sentient beings. On top of this, his focus was also entirely disturbed by yet another encounter with his aunt. Milarepa's aunt was a conniving woman. Even though Milarepa's estate fell into abysmal disrepair, some value could still be extracted from it. The only reason it was untouched for all of these years was because people feared the guardian deities of Milarepa's black magic. Now that Milarepa has returned, the aunt could jump on the opportunity to get the estate again. She visited Milarepa in his cave and told him very directly she would like to cultivate his field, but she first needs his guarantee that he won't summon any storms or plagues on anybody that touches his property. She presented this as an offer for Milarepa's benefit. She would be doing him a favor. If he lets her cultivate his field, she would bring him a steady supply of crops, so that he can continue his meditation in peace and not have to disturb it by begging. Milarepa was not stupid, however. He knew that even if she would bring him supplies, it would be a tiny portion of the whole harvest, and after some time she would probably stop bringing him anything at all. Not wanting to cause any further drama, however, Milarepa agreed. He was proven right very quickly. The aunt brought him supplies twice, each time noting that the villagers were unhappy about their business together. On the third time that she came, she said she would never be coming again. The villagers are far too angry about their deal. They were threatening to kill both of them. Who does she think she is to do business with this murderer? This anger on behalf of the villagers was, of course, made up by the aunt. Milarepa knew the reality here. The villagers were far too afraid of him to ever do anything. He could easily move back into his house if he wanted to, and they would still never touch him. If they do, he just has to threaten violent magic again. His aunt was playing him, and the uncle was most probably involved somehow as well. But this did not matter. A product of Milarepa's recent meditations had been the realization that if not for his aunt and uncle, he wouldn't have embarked on this path in the first place. He came to feel a very peculiar sort of gratitude for them. All the pain they had caused, all that physical and mental suffering, landed him before Marpa's feet. Their cruelty was indeed unforgivable, but it was also essential to his journey. It was the cause, and the effect is still very tangible today. 1,000 years later, we find ourselves here, discussing Milarepa's life. Without their influence, Milarepa very well may have ended up as a nobody of historical significance or spiritual significance. Instead, he now stands among the holy men of one of the largest religions in the world. Marpa and his predecessors foresaw this as well. Milarepa agreed to the conditions of his aunt. She wanted to sell the field on his estate and give him a portion of the earnings. With these earnings, he was to leave the region forever. She never wanted to see him again, neither did the uncle, and according to her, the same applies to the villagers. Still overwhelmed by a deep sense of gratitude, Milarepa agreed entirely, and thus having received a decent amount of funds for his journey, Milarepa left his childhood place permanently. As instructed by Marpa, it was time for him to retreat to Horsetooth White Rock and undertake the most serious attempt yet at mastering meditation. The spiritual peak of Milarepa's life occurred during this period of his life. One final disappointment in the form of seeing his village was the right fuel for Milarepa to finally take his proper retreat. His first major meditation, which lasted over 5 years, occurred at Horsetooth White Rock. This is a mountain in Tibet. After these 5 years, Milarepa then spent several more years going down the list that Marpa gave him of various caves and mountaintops where he was to meditate. At some point during this long journey, Milarepa finally reaped the seeds that he and Marpa had sown some 2 decades prior. His understanding fully matured and culminated in enlightenment. As much as I would like to continue going through Milarepa's life in detail, this time period is awfully sparse in the traditional accounts of his life. Years and years go by with very little that occurs. As far as we are concerned, we have seen the vast majority of Milarepa's life by this point. What is left to us now is to fill in the blanks with theory and the few nuggets of information available here and there. It is only around the time of Milarepa's passing that the story really begins to fill in again. We will see this in a while. As we have said several times by this point, all of this is quite natural. It is in line with the secretive nature of Vajrayana Buddhism. A scholar who is compiling Milarepa's biography cannot be expected to know the teachings and techniques that only Milarepa himself had ever heard. The scholar, of course, will also never be able to properly describe how the enlightenment process went for Milarepa, how it felt. I quite like the story of how Hermann Hesse struggled to finish his great Siddhartha for this very same reason. He abandoned the novel for about 1.5 years because he felt that he did not have enough personal experience to describe Siddhartha's enlightenment properly. There are only 2 episodes truly of note that occur here. One of them is another chance encounter with his aunt, who comes to him in a state of despair. Her old age was causing her to reflect on her life of cruelty, and in her misery, she sought out the wisdom of Milarepa, who had by this point attained quite a reputation indeed for his determination to meditate. Milarepa, of course, forgave her and shared with her a portion of the Dharma teaching, hoping for her own enlightenment. At the end of the day, she is yet another sentient being. She is still chained within the cycle of death and rebirth due to ignorance. According to the life of Milarepa, his aunt did indeed go on to become a great practitioner, and she did achieve enlightenment in her very old age, therefore atoning for her lifelong sins against the Mila family. Another episode of note is the reconciliation of Milarepa with his sister. Through word of mouth, she learned that Milarepa had indeed come back all those years prior to the village, when she had already left for her life of begging. However, this reconciliation is not as beautiful and emotional as one would expect. By the point that his sister found him, Milarepa was already very deep into his practice. He had detached from the world and from his connections. And so while his sister insisted that she bring him supplies and help him, as well as asking him to abandon the path and live a normal life with her on several occasions, Milarepa ignored all of this. The only tie he had was to Marpa and to Marpa's instructions. Everything else was ephemeral, although we do have to point out that it was his sister who activated Milarepa's first episode of true perfect insight. We will return to this in a moment. Instead of recounting these episodes in greater detail than I just did, and the numerous other small occurrences that happened during Milarepa's long retreat, I would like to focus instead on his meditation itself. More specifically, his physical conditions, but also the practices that we do know he focused on. Essentially, we will look at meditation as a whole, so as to better understand how exactly Milarepa progressed down the path to enlightenment. This is a gap that we will have to mostly fill in ourselves, for as we said, the narrative does not really pick up again until the time of Milarepa's passing. Considering that Milarepa took his first major retreat around the age of 45 and that he passed away around the age of 84, this is a 40-year period of which we know very little in terms of actual biography. If you are interested in understanding what sort of teachings came from this 40-year period, however, then I strongly advise reading the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa as a supplement to his biography. Traditionally, meditation is not simply about slowing yourself down and relaxing, clearing your mind of negative thoughts and reaching some sort of stress-free mental state for the sake of avoiding stress. This is a Western popularization of what is otherwise an extremely ancient and still rather esoteric practice. Just as an illustrative example, take a look at the practice of Asubha Bhavana, i.e. reflections on repulsiveness. During his meditation, the Buddhist practitioner focuses mentally on some specific body part of his and imagines it to be decaying. The greater the focus, the greater the imagined state of decay, to the point where the decay and mortification of this body part can actually be physically felt. Such a meditation assists in detaching from physical sensation by realizing that it is not trustworthy. Without any external stimuli, the body part in question is still experiencing severe pain. There is also an unpleasant smell, and so on. Pain, and all of these related things, are therefore only a confusing byproduct. At the same time, the practitioner makes peace with the pain of decay and gangrene. He learns to sit with it, even if it is imagined, and therefore detaches yet again from the ephemeral confusions of the tangible world. I don't know about you, but to me this definitely does not appear to be the same sort of practice that you would find in a 30-minute mindfulness yoga class in the sunny valleys of California. Pardon my humor, of course. Generally speaking, Buddhist meditation aims at achieving a certain state of mind, not for the purposes of stress-free relaxation, but in order to create an appropriate mental canvas, a blank page. Upon this blank page, the practitioner can then think through various teachings. He can take them to their natural conclusions and so on. The two fundamental pillars here are samatha, i.e. tranquility, and vipassana, i.e. insight. A tranquil mind allows for lucid insight. Meditation, in one aspect, is thus the equivalent of a sterile laboratory. All interfering variables and errors are now subdued in a controlled mental environment. This sterile mental environment is not the end goal of meditation, but a means for further achievement. The same way that a scientific laboratory is not the end goal of science, it is simply a means for correct experimentation. In this sterile environment, the most fragile and complicated thoughts can be safely worked through. As we saw earlier, it was during his meditation under Marpa that Milarepa came to the most fundamental positions of Buddhist philosophy. He gave himself the proper mental space to think them through and also absorb them. Another aspect of meditation that is specific to Tibetan Buddhism is deity yoga, i.e. a meditation upon a deity. Here, the practitioner chooses a certain deity from the Buddhist tradition to meditate upon. He creates the perfect mental environment for this deity to function within. For example, in order to meditate on the bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, the practitioner must create a compassionate state of mind. It is within this state of mind that he will best be able to grasp and manifest Avalokiteshvara in his natural environment, so to speak. Taking this a stage further, Tibetan deity yoga has the practitioner imagine himself as the deity being meditated upon. Therefore, meditation is quite literally a transformation and incarnation of a deity. Again, in order to be able to imagine oneself as a bodhisattva of compassion, one must begin with a compassionate state of mind. Otherwise, it simply does not make sense. You would not learn how to fly a plane by driving a car. This meditation on deities and focusing on you yourself being an emanation of some specific deity therefore results in a profound understanding that the divine and the worldly are one. Otherwise, this manifestation would not be possible. The practitioner reaches nearer and nearer to enlightenment by understanding that the formerly enlightened and the enlightened to be are of the same nature and can manifest in each other. In short, the practitioner imagines himself a god among gods. Of course, it does not stop here. This was the generating stage, where the practitioner generates an image and sensation of a deity within him. At the highest levels, he is then to pass into the so-called completion stage, where he deconstructs the image and sensation, thus showing that everything in its primary form reverts to nothingness. Such mental practice only makes up one half of meditation. The other half belongs to physical practice. A most fundamental one is, of course, breathing. Even without practicing any yoga at all, we know very well that taking a moment to breathe has instantaneous effects. The heart slows down when holding one's breath and exhaling. It regulates after as little as 1 minute of slow, purposeful breathing. If the body is adequately relaxed and stationary, one can picture his breath filling the lungs, filling the blood, and being carried throughout the body by the beating heart. This is the quintessential ancient pillar of practice from the Buddha himself, from Siddhartha Gautama. Guided by this stable breath, the experienced meditator can then shift his attention to other mental matters, the body now breathing attentively all on its own. This is a mindfully cultivated physical habit that allows for further, deeper, difficult thought. In Tibetan Buddhism, this breathing practice serves as the baseline for many other practices. For example, once the body has been adequately pacified by mindful breathing, the practitioner can focus on contemplating bardo. This is the intermediary state between life and death. The pacified body is no longer an obstacle. The practitioner recognizes that his body is also bound by the same laws of cause and effect, and is therefore stripped of independent existence. Since it is stripped of independent existence, he can become a master of the processes that make up this vessel, and he can thus commandeer it into all sorts of states. He can command it to lucid dream, remaining perfectly aware that it is merely his body that is sleeping. The umbrella term for this is dream yoga. Within his lucid dreaming, he can even simulate his death or achieve physical feats that one would otherwise never be capable of. He can communicate with those who broke out of the cycle of death and rebirth, and so on. It is rather difficult to speak on these practices with full clarity. First of all, most of us are not practitioners. And generally speaking, there is a reason why these advanced techniques require the assistance of a Lama who himself has honed these techniques for decades. When it comes to these practices, it is a common saying among the teachers that no textual information can adequately transmit these teachings. It is all mostly a matter of one-on-one physical guidance. One specific practice that we can speak of, however, is the practice of tumo, or inner heat. This practice was entrusted to Milarepa specifically by Marpa in those last few moments they spent together before Milarepa left him permanently. It was to be his main focus. A prophetic dream stated that Milarepa would master this technique above all others. Simply put, tumo is the practice of gaining control over one's bodily processes at the highest stage of yoga, i.e. the completion stage, once all of the mental images have been successfully constructed and deconstructed. In order to reach this stage, one begins at the generation stage. The practitioner meditates on the mental image of a deity of the same name, Tumo. She is a female goddess of flame and passion. Having conjured this image successfully in a mental and bodily state of fierce passion and restlessness, the practitioner imagines himself to be this very same deity. He absorbs and sits peacefully with this manifestation and then deconstructs it, therefore leaving no deity behind. The only thing that is left behind is the sensation of fierce heat in the body, which the practitioner has by this point learned to control. Please keep in mind that summarizing this practice took us a very short time, but the actual achievement of this practice takes years and years of careful and at times dangerous concentration. The end result of this practice, in the completion stage, is that the practitioner raises his body temperature by a rather significant amount. He is able to visualize every channel within his body and send this fierce flaming energy all throughout. By energizing his body with this heat, including his brain, he is able to increase his general health, his energy levels, and his computing power. In this way, he nears enlightenment, experiencing never-before-seen warm bliss. Ideally speaking, he maintains this inner fire permanently and uses the energy gained from this blissful state to assist all other sentient beings on their own paths to liberation. It is safe to assume that after Milarepa reached his enlightenment, this is precisely what he did. He maintained his inner fire permanently, even after he was fatally poisoned by an envious teacher. To summarize, meditation in the Buddhist school of thought, and especially in Vajrayana Buddhism, is much more complex than simply relaxing your body and clearing your mind. It serves very certain, specific purposes. Entire months of meditation can be dedicated to one specific aim. For example, simulating the sensation of death or simulating the pain of losing a limb. In Tibet, it goes as far as temporarily becoming the physical manifestation of a deity. A variety of practices are used as a supplementation and guide for one's meditation. The practitioner can meditate on a specific symbol and attempt to fully absorb it, making the symbol a reality. This is a very complex topic within Vajrayana Buddhism, that the symbol and what it symbolizes are one and the same, i.e. the symbol is reality itself. The practitioner can even meditate on a specific sound and try to transfer his consciousness into the very essence of this sound. Much like Marpa did, the meditator can thus become the sound Om itself, and so on. Meditation is therefore the bread and butter of good Buddhist practice. Without it, there is no inner experience. You only have unapplied theory. The conditions that Milarepa meditated in were not favorable at all. I would go as far as to say that most of us, modern men, wouldn't survive longer than a few weeks in the snow-capped mountains of Tibet, never mind decades like Milarepa did. The winters were extremely harsh, and Milarepa had nothing to keep himself warm. The jacket that his aunt offered him at some point had fallen apart, and from his old clothes only a few rags of cotton remained. This is in fact the meaning behind Milarepa's name. He is Mila, wrapped in cotton. In Tibetan, Milarepa. Here, the practice of Tummo evidently had an additional benefit. Indeed, it was a necessary practice. Mastery over the heat of his body ensured that he would survive the winters without needing to descend from his cave and break his concentration. In the summers, the conditions weren't much better. Tibet is a cold place. The highest temperatures never cross 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. Just to put it into perspective, these are winter temperatures for certain countries in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. In theory, Milarepa of course could have just made himself some new clothes. Indeed, he did have the materials required. His cotton rags could be repurposed and sewn into a proper blanket at least. But Milarepa had a profound concern that dissuaded him from doing anything except meditating. He kept posing the same question. Were I to die tonight, wouldn't it be better to spend my time meditating while I still can? This applied to sewing. This applied to speaking to someone. This applied to everything, really. If Milarepa were to die that night, he couldn't risk missing one final insight in favor of sewing some temporary clothes. That final insight could very well be the difference between him breaking the cycle of death and rebirth or being reborn yet again into a life of suffering and ignorance. There was a bigger issue, however, an issue that couldn't simply be ignored by doubling down on the practice of Tummo or meditation as a whole. Milarepa was hungry. The body needs food. Even if it is starved to its lowest possible weight, even if every muscle atrophies and nothing but skin and bones are left, there still remains a base metabolic rate. The body still needs to eat. Milarepa's meditation was very often disturbed by just how hungry he was, how painful the sensation was that his body is eating itself. At times, people came and brought him food, nice food, and though it did help temporarily, he would notice an inkling of desire left over in him. The thought of eating nice food again later on, when these people would come back, distracted him from his meditation. He had to resort to much wilder means. The only vegetation that grew inside and around his cave were nettles. Touching a nettle plant with your bare hands will leave you covered in stinging, itchy hives. But nettles can be cooked and then consumed safely. You can also make tea from nettles. It is quite nice. These plants are not the most calorically dense food, but they are better than nothing at all, and for Milarepa this was ultimately enough. He rejected the notion of ever eating nice food again in order to avoid attachment to it, and instead subsisted for years on a diet of cooked nettles and nettle tea. Depictions of Milarepa in art very often show him with green skin. After all, our bodies are made up of what we eat. Milarepa's strict nettle diet was reflected through his waxy green skin. In Milarepa's own words, "My body was wasted by asceticism. My eyes were sunk in their sockets. All my bones protruded. My flesh was dried out and green. The skin covering my fleshless bones looked like wax. The hair on my body had become coarse and gray. From my head it streamed down in a frightening flood. My limbs were about to fall apart." Milarepa lived like this for an indeterminate amount of years. Whenever somebody visited him, he would sing his songs for them, within which, as we saw already, were contained core teachings of the Buddhist philosophy. Somewhere within this cold, seemingly endless retreat, the sufferings of Milarepa's early life finally faded away. They eroded, and his consciousness had finally reached its full capacity for lucid, perfect insight. In short, somewhere along this strict meditation journey, Milarepa finally reached enlightenment. This mental clarity came on suddenly after an emergency meal brought by nobody other than his sister. She forced him to eat physically, and at this moment, Milarepa felt countless years of internal energy finally unleash. In that moment, and for some time following, he felt every internal obstruction melt away. Over a decade of meditation culminated in full, total awareness of every cell within his body synchronizing as a perfect unity with the rest of the perceivable world. In his own words, "I attained an experience of joy, lucidity, and pure awareness, very similar to what I had known about only from theory. In fact, it was an extraordinary experience of illumination which was both very powerful and very stable. Having overcome all obstacles, I realized that imperfections are also perfections. Even through discriminating conceptual thought, I perceived the inherent simplicity of the Dharma. I understood that in general all things related to the cycle of death and rebirth and to Nirvana are interdependent. Furthermore, I perceived that consciousness is fundamentally neutral. Suffering is the result of a wrong point of view. Nirvana and enlightenment are realized through perfected awareness. I perceived that the essence of everything lies in an empty and luminous awareness. More particularly, this special experience of my illumination was the fruit of my previous meditations and the immediate effects of food, as well as the profound instructions of my Lama. I also had a very special understanding that the methods of the Vajrayana path are for the transformation of all sensory experience into spiritual attainment. Coming to this profound realization and feeling, Milarepa meditated once more. During this meditation, the first meditation that he would do in his most lucid, enlightened state, he had the sensation of being able to change his body at will. He could levitate through space and perform miracles. At night, he could explore the entire universe in his dreams and transform himself into hundreds of different material and spiritual bodies. Using this ability to transform within his dreams, he visited every realm of the universe and listened to every teaching of the various Buddhas he found there. He then preached the Dharma himself to every being he came across. His body was covered in flames, even as he dove into the deepest, wettest waters. Having thus obtained inconceivably miraculous powers, Milarepa continued to meditate on, joyfully and with heightened spirit. His guardian deities would visit him in his heightened meditative state and instruct him to keep going, to follow the instructions of Marpa. This is the way that he would set the best example possible for the future disciples of the world. And so Milarepa meditated until he felt that it was time to leave this nettle cave and move on to the other caves that Marpa had told him about. On the way to each cave, Milarepa had a chance to impart his teachings on whoever crossed his path. He did this almost exclusively through song. Songs that would stay in the mind forever and cause every sentient being to eventually dedicate themselves to the Dharma as well. In this way, he gathered disciples who would announce the news of Milarepa's arrival to some new cave among their own respective communities. Everybody from these communities would then pour like waterfalls into these caves in order to lay their eyes on the miraculous green Milarepa. They would pray that he sing them a song and initiate their contact with the Dharma. Simply abiding by Marpa's instructions to seek out caves for meditation, Milarepa effortlessly grew his following and disseminated the Dharma to every sentient being. The prophecy had therefore been fulfilled. Milarepa later summarized this period to his disciples right before his death. He said the following: "The Dharma is so effective that even a great sinner like myself has reached a stage not far from enlightenment due to my belief in the karma, my subsequent renunciation of the aims of worldly life, and due especially to my single-minded devotion to meditation. If you receive initiation and the secret instruction which brings spontaneous awakening, unclouded by conceptualizations, and if you then meditate under the guidance of an enlightened Lama, you will undoubtedly attain enlightenment for yourself. If you commit the 10 harmful deeds and the 5 deadly sins, then without doubt you will be reborn into the torments of the lowest realms. This is because there is no belief in karma and little devotion to the Dharma. Whoever wholeheartedly believes in karma and dreads the suffering of the lower realms, a great longing for illumination will arise in him. This will lead him to devote himself to a Lama, to meditation, and to maintaining a deeper insight. It is possible for every ordinary man to persevere as I have done. To consider a man of such perseverance as the reincarnation of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva is a sign of not believing in the short Vajrayana path. Put your faith in the great law of cause and effect. Contemplate the lives of enlightened teachers. Reflect upon karma, the misery of the cycle of existence, the true value of human life, and not knowing the hour of death. Devote yourself to the practice of the Vajrayana. I deprived myself of food, clothing, and recognition. I strengthened my mind, and without concern for the hardships imposed on my body, I went to meditate in the solitude of the mountains. Then, the virtue of the spiritual state manifested itself. As a result of my meditation, I have achieved total awakening, wherein the object meditated upon, the action of meditating, and the subject who meditates merge into one, so that I no longer know how to meditate. Follow my example with your whole heart." Milarepa spent the remainder of his life between meditation, travel, and the instruction of his ever-growing group of disciples. Among these disciples was his aunt, who, as we said, went on to redeem her life of cruelty and achieve enlightenment as an accomplished yogini. Among these disciples, we also find Milarepa's main student, Gampopa, who for the first time codified Milarepa's ascetic teachings and therefore formed the foundation of Milarepa's educational lineage. This is the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. This educational lineage was connected back to Marpa and his Indian teachers, who themselves claimed to be part of an unbroken chain that begins with the historical Buddha. Very briefly, the Kagyu school synthesizes the meditation practices exemplified by Milarepa with the wider theoretical approach of Buddhist practice, i.e. the realization of the mind's emptiness and luminosity, guided by a strict step-by-step regimen of various meditation practices. We saw some of these practices earlier, for example, deity yoga. How this differs from the currently dominant school of Gelug, championed by the Dalai Lama himself, is that it integrates tantric practice very early on in the journey of the student, whereas the Gelug school prioritizes analytical mastery instead. In the Gelug school, tantric practice is integrated only after the student displays a near-perfect scholarly understanding of emptiness and of the Buddhist canon as a whole. Regardless, our story is not over just yet. There remains one final episode, the death of Milarepa. As we just said, Milarepa spent an indeterminate amount of time, anywhere between 15 to 35 years, building a circle of students. He did not do this consciously. As far as Milarepa was concerned, he was simply following the divine instructions of his most venerable Lama, Marpa the Translator. All those years prior, he was instructed to meditate in a specific long list of caves. And just as it is with doing a job that you truly love, the positive byproducts simply follow. All that is required of you is to do your job consistently and well. Milarepa's reputation grew to encompass the entirety of Tibet and its neighboring countries. Prospective students would pour into whichever region he traveled to and observe his meditation. They would listen to his songs. Many teachers of the Dharma also came to pay their respects to the Enlightened One. They all hoped to take with them a nugget of his teaching and disseminate it to their own students. As is the case very often in human affairs, not every teacher came with a kind heart. There were plenty of those who envied Milarepa's achievements or considered him as nothing more than a crook, a phony who lied about his powers. One such teacher was Geshe Tsakpuwa. Lama Geshe distinguished himself through his wealth. He was a very rich Lama from the region of Drin, and due to his wealth he had quite an influence with the local people. At first, he made a show of honoring Milarepa, but then rather quickly came to envy him. He wanted to embarrass Milarepa before his crowd of students, and so he continuously pretended to be burdened by a great sense of doubt. This sense of doubt gave him the pretense to consistently visit Milarepa and pose him a variety of difficult questions, in hopes of confusing him, thus putting his inadequacy on display. At some point, Milarepa was invited as a guest of honor to a wedding feast in the region of Drin. Lama Geshe immediately took the opportunity to attend as well. He sought out Milarepa at this feast and prostrated himself before his feet. His expectation was that Milarepa would return this display of respect. After all, Lama Geshe was a local man of influence. But Milarepa only ever prostrated himself before his own Lama Marpa. It would be disrespectful to the memory of the now deceased Marpa to get on the ground before anybody else's feet. Milarepa did not return the prostration. Lama Geshe thought to himself, how could this be? A man as learned as myself paying homage to an ignorant fool and receiving no homage in return. I will make him pay for my embarrassment. Lama Geshe pulled out a book on Buddhist logic and asked Milarepa to explain it word by word, pretending to be genuinely confused and full of doubt about the difficult material inside. Milarepa did not fall for the bait. He simply said, "You know very well the conceptual meaning of this text, but the real spiritual meaning is found in abandoning the 8 worldly reactions and the personal ego, through destroying false perceptions of reality by realizing the single flavor of samsara and nirvana, and through meditating in mountain solitude. Apart from that, arguing over words and pointing out what comes after what is totally useless if one does not practice the Dharma. I have never studied logic. I know nothing about it, and if I ever did, I have forgotten it by now." Milarepa then sang a song summarizing the fruits of his long meditation, that he assimilated the teaching in his consciousness through action, forgetting to engage in doctrinal polemics. Meditation is key. Action prevails over theory. Lama Geshe was infuriated by this evasive response and berated the master. He claimed that his learned arguments were superior to anything Milarepa had ever done. "I had hoped you were a noble man." Everybody present at the wedding was dismayed at Lama Geshe's behavior. They were quick to point out that he is not the only teacher of the Dharma in the world. There are many others like him with the same amount of wealth and influence, in fact. But there is none other like Milarepa. Seeing that it was pointless to argue with a crowd that was entirely on Milarepa's side, Lama Geshe did not protest. He thought to himself, Milarepa acts and jests like a madman who knows nothing. Through his lies and imposture, he is degrading the teaching of the Buddha and living on gifts obtained by deceit. I, who have got so much knowledge and am the richest and most influential man in this region, now count for less than a dog in religious matters. I must do something about this. Lama Geshe's solution was to mix poison into a jar of milk and have his concubine deliver it to Milarepa. Milarepa, being an alleged impostor, will have no way of discerning that the milk is poisoned, and therefore he will drink it, die, and prove that Lama Geshe is the superior man. He incentivized his concubine to go through with this plan by promising her a large gemstone upon her completion of the task. It goes without saying that Milarepa was perfectly aware of this scheme. First of all, he was aware that the concubine would come and go through with her instructions, for she desired the reward much more than she desired the Dharma. Secondly, Milarepa was also perfectly aware of the fact that this was another opportunity for a teaching. He had to drink the poison, for it was his responsibility to turn this into a teaching. Much like Nagarjuna, he bore the heavy weight of saving other sentient beings. Sometimes the cost of salvation is death. Milarepa was not bothered by this. As he saw it, his foremost disciples were already set onto their paths. Their enlightenment was basically guaranteed. Therefore, his primary work was completed, and every other interaction he would have from this point onwards was but a secondary concern. Furthermore, enlightenment does not negate the death of the physical vessel, the body, and this physical vessel had grown very old. After all, Milarepa was now in his 80s. Regardless whether he is poisoned or succumbs to the weaknesses of his aging body instead, it was his time to go. Lama Geshe's concubine brought the poison to Milarepa. Milarepa refused to drink it. His reason was that if he drank it now, the concubine wouldn't even get her reward. The Lama was a liar. He sent the concubine home with the poison, and she tried to convince Lama Geshe that Milarepa was onto them, but he disagreed. If he really had clairvoyance, he wouldn't have told you to bring it back and get the gemstone first. He would have made you drink the poison yourself. Since he didn't do that, it only proves that he does not possess clairvoyance. He handed her the gemstone and told her to go again. This time he promised that if she convinces Milarepa to drink the poison, he will make her his wife. She will have a share in all of his wealth, his property, and his bed. This was enough to convince his concubine. She came to Milarepa again, and Milarepa took the milk out of her hands. He smiled at her and asked, "So you have been given the gemstone for the deed you are carrying out?" Overwhelmed with confusion at this question, the concubine instantly fell before Milarepa's feet and began weeping. She confirmed that she did indeed receive the gemstone and then begged Milarepa to not drink the poison. Instead, he should give it back to her so that she herself can drink it and end her life of evil doing. Milarepa reflected on all of this for a moment and then responded. "First of all, I have too much compassion to let you drink this poison. It would violate the essence of the Bodhisattva precepts and would bring with it grave spiritual consequences. My mission is complete and my life is coming to an end. My time has come to go to another realm. By itself, the drink could not harm me in the least. It doesn't matter whether I drink it or not, but if I had drunk it the first time, you would not have received the gemstone as payment for your crime. Now that the gemstone is in your hands, I will drink the poison, both to satisfy the Lama's desire and to be sure that you have rightfully earned the gemstone. As for the Lama's other promises, let me tell you that they will not be fulfilled. He said many things about my behavior. There is no truth in what he said, so both of you will experience terrible remorse. When this happens, in order to purify yourself, strive toward self-realization in this life. Even to save your life, do not commit any similar crimes. Call upon me and my spiritual sons with a sincere heart. Both you and the Lama have always cut yourself off from happiness and sought out sorrow. This time I will see if I can purify you of your evil karma. Speak to no one of this while I am still alive. Afterwards, everyone will hear about it anyway. Although you have neither seen with your eyes nor heard with your ears the truth of my previous sayings, keep well in mind these words I speak now. The moment will come when you will see that they are true." Having thus spoken, Milarepa drank the poison. The concubine retold everything that happened to Lama Geshe, who did not carry out his promise of making her into a wife. He of course disregarded all of this as the ravings of a madman. As far as he was concerned, Milarepa would now die an impostor's death. Meanwhile, Milarepa ordered his disciples to prepare for a ritual feast. Every man who ever wished to see Milarepa was allowed to come. The invitations were spread through every corner of Tibet. Massive droves of people poured into Chuvar, where Milarepa held this feast, and he spent many days speaking to them on all the essential doctrines of the Dharma. During this time, the sky was filled with gods listening to the words of the Master. Rainbows appeared all over the sky, symbols of parasols and innumerable banners filled the atmosphere. There was a constant rain of flower petals in 5 different colors. Tibet was drowning in exquisite beauty and fine music. It is said that among those who gathered, the most highly developed realized the true meaning of the Dharma. The less highly developed experienced awareness of non-duality in a lucid and joyful state, and they were set upon the path of liberation. Among the least developed, there was not one person who did not embrace the practice of compassion for all sentient beings. After many days of teaching, Milarepa made his final public announcement. O you monks and disciples, gods and men, all assembled here, our coming together in pursuit of the Dharma has been due to your spiritual aspirations in previous lives. Now that I am old, I do not know if I will see you many times more. Try your best to practice the teaching I have given you. Do not waste your time. If you follow my instructions, you will be the first of my disciples to be reborn in the pure land of my Buddhahood. Therefore, rejoice. He then sang a song blessing the families and homes of every single disciple that had gathered for these many, many days before his feet. The small handful of his closest disciples understood very well what was happening. Milarepa had started to display symptoms of illness. His Tummo practice was still going strong, but the rhetoric of his lessons sounded very much as that of a dying man. No matter how much they implored their master to accept some medicine, he refused. He cited the same reason again and again, that he is an old man, he has achieved his primary aims, his students have been set on their paths. It would only hurt them to administer medicine out of desperation and fear of losing their Lama. This was another opportunity for them to practice non-attachment and realize that even the physical vessel of their venerable master is also fleeting, just as fleeting as everything else. Milarepa's body was like those towers he had built decades ago for Marpa. No matter their beauty and their height, they were to be torn down. Even the final tower will, at some point, come crumbling down. But as of right now, this day has still not come. Let us remember that Milarepa was not even allowed to complain about having to tear these towers down and start over again and again. In the same fashion, his students were also not allowed to complain or feel pain about the tearing down of yet another physical vessel, Milarepa's body. If they stayed true to the teaching, Milarepa would always be with them anyway, living on in the form of songs until every sentient being was liberated. The students slowly made peace with the looming passing of their master. Wanting to honor him after his death, they inquired as to the details of his funeral and how his personal belongings should be distributed. Once again, Milarepa quickly shut down all of these concerns. Having been a lowly hermit and simply another part of the wider universe, he needs no funeral and he needs no celebration. His foremost disciples must not concern themselves with such worldly matters. As he told them many times, they must stick only to their meditation. Milarepa progressively worsened in his condition. Rumors began to spread that this famous master is dying, and these news eventually reached Lama Geshe himself. He, of course, wanted to see Milarepa's grave condition with his own eyes, to confirm that he had brought down this alleged impostor. Under the pretense of making an offering, Lama Geshe arrived before Milarepa's sickbed and was left to speak with him privately, one-on-one. Lama Geshe continued to test Milarepa. He told him that his sickness is very unfortunate, but why doesn't he use his miraculous powers to share the disease with his disciples? If he transfers equal portions of it between all of his students, then none of them would really suffer that much. Milarepa's body would survive and he could continue teaching. It goes without saying that Lama Geshe doubted Milarepa's powers and believed deep down that Milarepa was simply unable to transfer his illness. But the question was worth asking anyway. Milarepa responded, "You of all people know very well that my illness had no natural cause. Perhaps it is not the most correct to even call it an illness. In any case, illness in an ordinary man is not the same as illness in a spiritual man. I should accept it as a special opportunity for inner transformation. For this reason, I bear my sickness as an ornament." Lama Geshe began to realize that Milarepa suspected him for the poisoning. Nevertheless, his excuses only prove that he is unable to perform miracles, otherwise he would have already transferred his illness. Lama Geshe doubled down on his position. "Transfer your illness to me. Show me your great powers, Master." Milarepa replied, "A certain being is possessed by the demon of egotism, which is the worst one of them all. It is he who has caused my illness. If I shared my illness with you, you could not bear it for an instant. I shall not transfer it." Lama Geshe continued pushing and insisting that Milarepa transfer his illness. What he really wanted was to witness Milarepa's death right there and then. Unable to save himself, he wanted the satisfaction of seeing Milarepa fail. But Milarepa finally succumbed to his requests. He told him to look at the door of the room and transferred the illness to this door. Immediately, the wooden door cracked and fell apart. The ground shook beneath it. But Lama Geshe was not convinced. Magic tricks are very easy to orchestrate, especially if one has spent his whole life mastering these tricks, as Milarepa allegedly did. He told Milarepa once again to transfer the illness to him as definitive proof of his powers. Milarepa agreed. Unimaginable torment and pain filled every cell of Lama Geshe's body immediately. His throat began to close, he began to suffocate and seize on the floor in pain. Blood began streaming out of every orifice in his body. A few more seconds of this would have killed him, but Milarepa quickly withdrew his illness. He then told him, "I have only given you half of my illness and you could not bear it." Coming back to his senses, Lama Geshe broke down and wept before Milarepa's feet. He was suffocated by remorse. He cried out, "O precious master, O saint, it is just as you said. One who was possessed by a demon did this evil to you. It was me. I offer you my house, my wealth, and all of my property. Please help me to free myself from the consequences of my actions. I sincerely beg you for your forgiveness." Lama Geshe's desperate weeping filled the air all around Milarepa's dwelling, but it was quickly cut short by yet another song. Milarepa sang to Lama Geshe that he forgives him, that he has great compassion for him, and that he must abide by his teachings if he ever wants to be liberated from his remorse. After all, Milarepa had great experience indeed when it comes to the weight of remorse. Lama Geshe vowed to abide by his teaching forever. He would retreat to a cave and adopt the life of a hermit, shedding his name and identity until he fully atones. He pledged all of his property to be distributed among the disciples of Milarepa. In fact, Lama Geshe's wealth would be used every year to hold festivals in the memory of the great master by the common people. This entire episode was Milarepa's final personal lesson. Milarepa gathered his foremost disciples one last time. He let them ask any final questions and clarify their most urgent confusions. He then summarized everything he had ever said and taught through one final song. He sang on the virtues of the Vajrayana path, the importance of always abiding by the Dharma, the significance of compassion, and many other core tenets of his life. His final words were as follows: "I do not know if I have much longer to live. Now that you have heard me, do as I have done." He then entered into his very last deep state of meditation. And so, at the age of 84, at sunrise on the 14th day of the 12th month, in the year of the wood rabbit, the master Milarepa passed into Nirvana. At the time of Milarepa's death, the entire region of Chuvar was adorned with infinite wonderful signs. Every deity had assembled there to greet the master. The sky was covered with a design of interlacing squares in all the colors of the rainbow. At the center of every square was a lotus with 8 multicolored petals, 4 of which, in sacred colors, pointed to the 4 directions of the compass. On every lotus there were drawings which in their geometry and architecture were far more marvelously designed than the works of any skilled artist or builder. Multicolored clouds floated on every layer of the atmosphere, constantly transforming into a variety of symbols representing every stage of Milarepa's life on Earth. A celestial orchestra serenaded for the ears of every Tibetan while the land drowned once again in a rainfall of flower petals. This was the most beautiful time that Tibet had ever seen. While the people rejoiced in the unfathomable beauty that surrounded them, the master Milarepa took his seat in the pure land of the Buddha, on top of his own crystal tower, now free from imperfections, surrounded by countless male and female deities. He was now a spiritual father to an ever-growing lineage and could be invoked from his crystal throne by any aspiring practitioner. His spiritual legacy was now cemented forever. While the people rejoiced, Milarepa's foremost students had one final concern: the cremation of their master's body. Each dedicated student, young and old, came to observe their master's resting face one last time before it would be burned, and to their amazement, his face reverted to that of an 8-year-old. Milarepa was now young again, he was beautiful again, as he had been as a young boy before all of his miseries befell him. The students made their final goodbyes and attempted to burn the body, but it would not burn. Instead, after some days of repeated attempts, it simply dissipated in a blinding sphere of light. This was accompanied by beautiful songs that were sung in the voice of a young boy. Milarepa's students were moved to tears by the realization that it is the young Milarepa singing to them from his blinding crystal throne one last time. During this song, they heard a certain set of instructions. They were to propagate the teaching and remember this moment forever. During moments of weakness, they can invoke the master, and he will sing to them again from his crystal throne, instilling in them a renewed feeling of purity and perseverance. Let them never dwell in weakness. Let them never forget to act with compassion, to breathe and meditate carefully, to strive after one final meeting with their master in the realm of ultimate reality, where the mind is free from any concepts, any of the world's imperfections. Let them strive for the sake of all sentient beings. Milarepa's youthful voice sang one last instruction. His disciples are to check the fireplace of the crematorium for Milarepa's final gift to the world. There they will find all of the gold that Milarepa managed to amass throughout his years as a wandering teacher. They are to distribute all of this hoarded gold to each and every person in Tibet. On this note, the blinding sphere of light dissipated, drying the tears of the students and filling them with a permanent sense of otherworldly bliss. The students rushed to the fireplace, tore it down, and found a tiny package, wrapped in cotton, with a note. They opened the note and read it out loud. My final gift to the world is a cube of raw sugar, a knife, and the piece of cloth which wraps these items. When cut with this knife, the sugar and the cloth will never be exhausted. Cut as many strips from the cloth and as many bits from the sugar as you can and distribute it among the people. Everyone who tastes the sugar and touches the cloth will gain liberation from the lower realms, because these things, being the food and clothing of Milarepa, were blessed by every Buddha of the past and future. Any sentient being who has heard the name Milarepa even once, and in whom it produces veneration, will not go through the cycle of rebirth in the lower realms for 7 lifetimes. Instead, they will reach liberation within this lifetime. This was prophesied by all of the Buddhas of the past. At the very bottom of this note, one final line appeared. To anybody who ever claims that Milarepa amassed gold and material wealth during his long life, let them eat shit. Milarepa's students broke out in laughter and bittersweet tears as they read these final words. The cube of raw sugar was sliced with the knife into countless pieces. Each part was as big as the original piece. Similarly, as the white cloth was cut into many pieces, each square became the same size as the original piece. This was distributed to every person that the disciples ever came across throughout the remainder of their lives. The sugar and the cloth each person received lasted their lifetime without being exhausted. Each person who received these goods eventually achieved complete enlightenment. They were as numerous as stars in the night. There were also many who successfully cut the cycle of death and rebirth, experiencing it for the last time in this lifetime, only ever having heard Milarepa's name. Those who embraced the Dharma in any capacity at all under the influence of the Master were far too numerous to be counted. Milarepa caused the teachings of the Buddha to blaze forth like bright sunshine and guided these sentient beings away from temporary and permanent miseries toward happiness and the root of happiness, i.e., emptiness. Such was the life of Jetsun Milarepa. Even though our journey today took us quite a while, and I apologize for my numerous digressions, these couple of hours are nothing when compared to the lifelong pursuit of the Dharma that Milarepa embraced. The returns on his journey are impossible to define, they are simply too large. It has now been 1,000 years that hundreds of thousands of students find comfort and meaning in this story. The tale of Milarepa is as familiar to the Tibetan people as is the tale of Red Riding Hood to the West. It is a fundamental guiding story that defines the imaginations of childhoods. Moreover, as much as it is filled with magical elements, it is at least partially real. Historians of all sorts are in agreement that Jetsun Milarepa did exist, that the tower he built for Marpa still stands. It now acts as a monastery for the Gelug school, in fact, under the name of Sekar Gutok. In southern Tibet, there is also a renowned cave where Milarepa's footprint can be allegedly seen at its very entrance. This footprint was embedded into some mud that hardened into rock over the past millennium. Thousands of people make the pilgrimage to see this footprint every year. At the most basic, accessible level, Milarepa's story serves as a constant reminder that no sin is unforgivable, at least to yourself. You should forgive your own sins, but you should never forget them. Milarepa never forgot the pain he was pushed to inflict on his village. Even in his final years, he would mention this act as a basis for his teaching. Any sinner who came to him overwhelmed by remorse could find comfort in the fact that Milarepa also sinned, and now he is an enlightened master, free of his remorse. I would like to once again stress the fact that it was the result of others pushing Milarepa that made him resort to extremes. Deeply lost and confused in her sufferings, it was his mother that threatened Milarepa to take her own life unless he gets revenge on the aunt and uncle. It was the aunt and uncle in the first place who caused these sufferings, and who knows which reasons caused them to resort to cruelty instead of simply taking in the Mila family after the death of his father. My point here is this. Every action breeds some kind of reaction, whether through a direct consequence or by instilling a certain mental state within both the doer and the receiver. This is one of the principles of Buddhist karma. Evil acts are to be avoided not only due to the physical harmful consequences, but also because they only further deepen the mental states that caused these acts in the first place. A man who consistently commits these unpleasant acts shifts his pattern of thought over time to continue rationally supporting these acts. It is like a drug. Once the barrier of taboo is broken and an individual begins to use drugs freely, his mind rationalizes this habit only further. This almost always ends with the most serious addiction, and the addict continuously jumps through all sorts of mental hoops to continue justifying his behavior. He continues to live in denial. Denial is, of course, another word for ignorance. It is through ignorance of certain truths and patterns that we remain stuck in the sufferings of the world, in personal sufferings and ultimately the painful cycle of death and rebirth. At least this is how the Buddhists see it. On a deeper level, the life of Milarepa is a perfect symbolic exposition on the virtues of Vajrayana Buddhism. We cannot ignore the fact that the primary texts on his life were written by followers of Tibetan Buddhism. There is undoubtedly an underlying motivation to present their views and beliefs in favorable, decorated light. There is a desire to use effective symbolism in order to have an effect on the audience. But we must also keep in mind, as we stated briefly at one point, that at a high level of Tibetan practice, symbol is separated from its symbolic function, i.e. a symbol and the reality it represents are one and the same. There is no representation at all. There is merely reality. Therefore, at an advanced stage of study, as unbelievable as it may be, the story of Milarepa's life is to be taken literally, word for word, with an understanding that the mere mental perception of these impossibilities makes them possible immediately. I'd like to refer you to something that Parmenides once posited. It is the same thing that can be thought and that can be. I would like to sincerely thank you for your time. My retelling of this story turned out to be much longer than I expected. Thank you for sticking through it, and I hope that you gained something out of our time spent together. Whether you subscribe to Buddhism or not, and I should say that despite my enthusiasm for this story, I am not a Buddhist, I still think it is a sign of great maturity to be able to appreciate these sorts of stories regardless of your personal leanings. After all, the human experience, or what we call the human condition, is equal for all of us. We all suffer. We all cling to things. We all want certain things. Our solutions to the suffering may be vastly different, but to deny an ever-present suffering would be naive. Based on the fact that everybody suffers, it also follows that we can extract useful moments from the lives of other sufferers. We should evaluate the quality of their outcomes since we are all positively united by the fact of our suffering. Arthur Schopenhauer spoke about this. Regardless, please let me know if you found this interesting, and do take a minute or two to hold Milarepa in your memory. I will see you next time.